Chapter 1. The Form in the Files. Arthur Weasley had always believed that paperwork was the backbone of civilization, even magical civilization. Especially magical civilization, if he was being honest with himself, considering how easily wizards could accidentally turn their neighbors into newts or bewitch their garden gnomes into staging elaborate theatrical productions. Someone had to keep track of it all, and Arthur had long ago made peace with being that someone. Tonight, though, as November rain drummed against the narrow windows of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, Arthur found himself questioning whether civilization's backbone might be fractured in places he'd never thought to look. The stack of post-war incident reports on his desk had grown rather than shrunk, despite 3 hours of steady filing. As every piece of parchment seemed to tell the same story. Wizards celebrating Voldemort's defeat with increasingly creative and dangerous magical displays. A family in Cornwall had enchanted their entire house to dance, and it was now doing a rather enthusiastic tango down their village's main street. A wizard in Yorkshire had attempted to create fireworks that spelled out Potter forever, and had instead managed to set his lawn aflame with letters that wouldn't stop burning. Arthur rubbed his eyes and reached for his tea, only to find the mug cold and filmed over with the particular grimness that seemed to settle on everything after midnight in a government building. He should have gone home hours ago. Molly would be worried, though she'd never say so directly. She'd simply fuss over him tomorrow morning, with extra rashers of bacon and pointed comments about the importance of proper rest. The thought of home, of Molly's warm kitchen, and baby Ginny's soft breathing from her cot, of the controlled chaos that 5 sons could create even in sleep, made Arthur's chest tight with longing. But the paperwork wouldn't file itself, and with the ministry still reeling from a year of war, everyone was expected to pull double shifts until some semblance of normalcy returned. He pulled the next form toward him, expecting another report of celebratory magical mishaps, and froze. The parchment was cream-colored and heavier than standard ministry issue, with the kind of subtle magical reinforcement that suggested importance. At the top, but in the crisp lettering that marked all official surveillance authorizations, were the words, "Request for comprehensive monitoring, priority level, exceptional." Arthur's first thought was that someone had misfiled spectacularly. Surveillance authorizations belonged to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, not to his little corner of the ministry where he spent his days cataloguing enchanted toasters and investigating reports of flying automobiles. His second thought, as his eyes traced down to the subject line, was that the world had gone quite mad without bothering to inform him. Subject: Potter, Harry James, date of birth, July 31st, 1980. Current location, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey authorization. Date, November 1st, 1981. Requested by Albus Percival, Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Order of Merlin First Class, or Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, Headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Arthur stared at the date until the numbers seemed to swim before his eyes. November 1st. Today. Or rather, yesterday, considering it was now well past midnight on November 2nd. The surveillance request had been filed mere hours ago, which meant it had been filed the day after James and Lily Potter died. Arthur's hands trembled as he held the parchment. Everyone in magical Britain knew the story by now, though the details were still emerging in bits and pieces through official channels and whispered rumors. Halloween night, Godric's Hollow, the boy who lived. Harry Potter, barely more than a baby, had somehow survived the killing curse that had claimed his parents. Voldemort was gone, destroyed, defeated, was reduced to nothing by whatever magic had protected the child. The wizarding world had spent the last day celebrating in the streets, dancing and singing, and setting off illegal fireworks that spelled out James and Lily's names in letters of gold and silver. Arthur had been among them, joining the impromptu celebration outside the ministry when news of Voldemort's defeat first broke. He'd thought, in his naive relief, that the nightmare was over, that Harry Potter would be safe now, surrounded by loving family and friends, protected by the peace his parents had died to secure. But this form suggested something else entirely. Arthur forced himself to read the rest of the document, his stomach growing heavier with each line. The surveillance request was comprehensive in a way that made his skin crawl. Monitoring of magical development. Yes, but also psychological evaluation, social interaction assessment, physical health tracking, and something called environmental stressor documentation that made Arthur's blood run cold. Why would anyone need to document a toddler's environmental stressors unless those stressors were expected to be significant? The authorization scope covered continuous surveillance through magical and technological means as deemed necessary by the requester. It included permission to monitor Harry's guardians, the Dursleys, Arthur noted, though he'd never heard the name before, as well as any individuals who came into contact with the child. The surveillance was authorized to continue indefinitely, subject to annual review by Dumbledore alone. Annual review, as if this were a long-term project rather than a temporary protective measure. Arthur set the form down with careful precision, as if sudden movements might cause it to explode. His mind raced, trying to find an innocent explanation for what he'd just read. Perhaps it was standard procedure for protecting important magical children. Perhaps the request had been filed in advance, before James and Lily's deaths, as a precautionary measure that had only now made its way through bureaucratic channels. But the date stamp was clear, burned into the parchment with the kind of magical authentication that couldn't be forged or altered. November 1st, 1981. The day after Harry Potter became an orphan. The day after he became the most famous wizard in Britain. The day after he was placed with relatives no one in the magical world seemed to know. Arthur pushed back from his desk and began to pace, his boots clicking against the stone floor in an irregular rhythm that matched his scattered thoughts. He'd worked in the ministry for nearly a decade, long enough to understand how these things worked. Surveillance requests required justification, approval from multiple departments, and clear articulation of the threat being monitored. Emergency authorizations existed for immediate dangers, but they were temporary by design and subject to rapid review. This form looked like none of those things. It looked like a carefully planned operation, authorized by someone with enough influence to bypass normal protocols. Someone who had known, even as the wizarding world celebrated, that Harry Potter would need to be watched. The question was why. Why would Dumbledore, of all people, feel the need to monitor a child he'd personally placed for protection? Why would Harry's environment need to be assessed for stresses? And why would the surveillance need to continue indefinitely, rather than ending when the immediate threat, Voldemort, had been eliminated? Arthur found himself thinking of his own children, sleeping safely in their beds at the Burrow. Bill and Charlie sharing their room, Percy tucked into his narrow bed with a book still clutched in his small hands, Fred and George curled together like puppies, despite having individual beds. Ron in his cot, thumb firmly planted in his mouth, and baby Ginny, barely 3 weeks old, breathing softly in the bassinet Molly insisted on keeping in their bedroom. What would Arthur do if someone handed him a form requesting comprehensive surveillance of one of his children? Or what would he think of the person making such a request? He would think they were planning something terrible, something that required knowing every detail of his child's life, every weakness, every point of leverage. Arthur stopped pacing and stared out the window at the London skyline, barely visible through the rain and darkness. Somewhere out there, Harry Potter was sleeping in a house in Surrey, surrounded by muggles, who might not understand the first thing about caring for a magical child. And someone Arthur had trusted implicitly, someone the entire wizarding world revered as their greatest defender, wanted to watch that child's every move. The smart thing would be to file the form properly, to send it along to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement where it belonged and pretend he'd never seen it. To trust that Albus Dumbledore, The man who had defeated Grindelwald and organized the resistance against Voldemort knew what he was doing. But Arthur Weasley had always been too curious for his own good, and too protective of children to ignore the small, insistent voice in his mind that whispered something was wrong. He returned to his desk and carefully folded the surveillance form, slipping it into his inner coat pocket, where it crinkled softly against his chest. Tomorrow, later today really, he would begin asking questions. Quietly, carefully, but persistently. He would find out who Harry Potter's guardians were and why they might need to be monitored. He would research surveillance protocols and discover what environmental stressor documentation actually meant in practice. And if he didn't like what he found, Arthur Weasley, a minor ministry employee and father of 6, would decide what to do about it. The remaining paperwork on his desk could wait another day. Some things, Arthur was beginning to realize, were more important than proper filing procedures, even in magical civilization. Chapter 2. Questions in the Dark. Arthur arrived home as the first pale light of dawn crept through the kitchen windows of the burrow, casting everything in the soft grey that made the world look tentative and uncertain. The surveillance form crinkled against his chest as he hung his coat on the peg by the door, a sound so small it might have been his own heartbeat, if not for the weight of what it represented. The kitchen smelled of cooling tea and the lingering warmth of yesterday's bread. Molly had left a plate covered with a clean tea towel on the table, and Arthur lifted the corner to find thick slices of her brown bread, a jar of strawberry jam, and a note written in her careful script. "You work too hard. Eat something. Love, M." The simple kindness of it made Arthur's throat tight. He could hear the house settling around him, full of sleeping children, and the quiet contentment that came from knowing everyone he loved was safe under his roof. It was a feeling he'd taken for granted until this morning, when a piece of parchment had reminded him how fragile safety could be. Arthur made fresh tea and sat at the scarred wooden table where his family ate every meal, where Molly planned their meagre budget and the children did their lessons. Where, just yesterday morning, they'd all celebrated the news of Voldemort's defeat with extra jam on their toast, and Bill solemnly declaring that he was glad the war was over, so Percy would never have to be afraid. Now Arthur stared at his steaming mug and wondered if the war was truly over at all, or if it had simply changed shape into something more subtle and infinitely more disturbing. The sound of soft footsteps on the stairs made Arthur quickly fold his hands over the spot where the surveillance form created a barely visible bulge in his shirt. Molly appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair braided for sleep, and baby Ginny cradled against her shoulder. Even at barely 3 weeks old, Ginny had the Weasley hair, fine red wisps that caught the early light like spun copper. "You're home late," Molly said, though there was no reproach in it, only the particular kind of weariness that came from being awake half the night with a newborn. Or early, I suppose. The paperwork seemed endless tonight, Arthur said, which was true enough. "How is she?" "Fussy. I think she's got her days and nights muddled." Molly moved to the stove with the practiced ease of a woman who could prepare a meal while half asleep and holding a baby. "I'll make you proper breakfast. You look pale." Arthur watched his wife bustle around their kitchen, efficient even in exhaustion, and felt the gulf between them widen with each passing moment. How could he tell her about the surveillance form? How could he explain that somewhere in Surrey, a baby not much older than Ginny was sleeping under the watchful eyes of people who might not have his best interests at heart? How could he tell her that Albus Dumbledore, the man they'd all trusted to keep them safe, might be the very person they needed protection from? "Arthur?" Molly was looking at him with the sharp attention that had made her such a formidable opponent to Death Eaters and crying children alike. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Arthur said quickly, then watched her eyebrows rise in the expression that meant she knew he was lying, but would let him get away with it for now. "Just tired." Molly set eggs and bacon to sizzling in the pan, Ginny still balanced against her shoulder. "Well, try to get some sleep today. The children will want to see you when they wake up. Percy's been asking if you think Harry Potter really defeated you-know-who all by himself. The mention of Harry's name made Arthur's chest tighten. What did you tell him? That we don't know exactly what happened, but we should be grateful to the Potter family for their sacrifice. Molly's voice softened. That poor little boy. I can't imagine being orphaned so young. I hope whoever's caring for him knows how precious he is. Arthur stared into his tea and said nothing. The silence stretched between them, filled with the comfortable sounds of breakfast preparation and Ginny's soft breathing, until Molly set a plate in front of him and settled into her own chair. "The Diggories sent word yesterday," she said, switching to the safer territory of neighborhood news. "Amos is beside himself with pride. Says if young Cedric keeps up his flying like this, he'll make the Hufflepuff Quidditch team when he gets to Hogwarts." Arthur nodded and made appropriate sounds of interest. But his mind was elsewhere, turning over the implications of what he'd discovered. If Dumbledore had personally authorized comprehensive surveillance of Harry Potter, then Dumbledore must also know exactly where the child was living, and with whom. The Dursleys, the form had said. Muggles in Surrey. Why would Dumbledore place the most famous wizard in Britain with Muggles? And why would those Muggles require monitoring for environmental stressors? "I should check on the others," Arthur said abruptly, standing before he'd finished half his breakfast. "Make sure Fred and George haven't tried to enchant their beds to fly again." Molly gave him another searching look, but didn't press. "They're still asleep, all of them. Even Ron went down easy last night." Arthur kissed the top of her head and breathed in the familiar scent of her hair, was trying to anchor himself in the solid reality of his family before venturing back into the uncertain territory his discovery had opened. "I love you," he said, meaning it more than she could possibly know. "I love you too, you impossible man. Now go get some rest before you fall over." But Arthur didn't go upstairs to bed. Instead, he slipped into the small study off the kitchen where he kept the family's important papers and his collection of Muggle contraptions that fascinated him so. The room was cramped and cluttered, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, but it was private. Here, surrounded by half-dismantled wireless sets and carefully labelled jars of screws and springs, Arthur could think. He pulled the surveillance form from his pocket and spread it on the desk. 'Twas weighing down the corners with a broken clock and a rubber duck he'd found in Diagon Alley. In the grey morning light, the parchment looked even more official and somehow more sinister than it had in his office. The magical authentication seal gleamed like a scar across the bottom of the page. Arthur had spent nearly 10 years working in various departments of the ministry, and he'd learned to navigate the bureaucratic maze that kept the magical government functioning. He knew which forms went where, which approvals were required for different types of operations, and most importantly, who had the authority to bypass normal procedures when circumstances demanded it. What he was looking at should not exist. A surveillance authorizations for magical children required approval from the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and the Wizengamot's Child Welfare Committee. They were temporary by design, subject to monthly review, and required detailed justification for their continuation. Emergency authorizations existed for cases of immediate danger, but those carried automatic expiration dates and mandatory judicial oversight. This form had none of those protections. It was signed by Dumbledore alone, with no co-authorizing signatures, no expiration date, and no oversight mechanism beyond Dumbledore's own annual review. It was less like a protective measure and more like a research proposal. The thought made Arthur's stomach turn. He stood and began to pace the small confines of the study, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. What if Harry Potter's placement with the Dursleys wasn't about protection at all? What if it was about control, about creating conditions that could be carefully monitored and documented? What if the boy who lived was less a hero being protected than a subject being studied? Arthur forced himself to sit back down and think methodically. He needed more information before he could draw any conclusions, no matter how disturbing those conclusions might be. He needed to know who the Dursleys were and why Dumbledore had chosen them. He needed to understand the scope of the surveillance and what it was meant to achieve. Most importantly, he needed to know if Harry Potter was safe. The problem was that all of that information was likely to be classified at levels far above Arthur's clearance. The misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office dealt with enchanted kettles and flying carpets, not state secrets, and the placement of famous orphans. Arthur's access to Ministry records was limited to his own department and a few adjacent areas where his work occasionally overlapped. But Arthur Weasley hadn't survived 2 decades of marriage to Molly, and nearly 10 years in the Ministry bureaucracy, without learning how to find information when he needed it. There were always ways, if you knew where to look and weren't too proud to ask for help. He pulled out a piece of parchment and began making notes, using the careful, methodical approach that had served him well in cataloguing magical artifacts. First, he would research everything publicly available about Harry Potter's placement. Surely there had been some official announcement about where the boy who lived would be living, even if the details were kept private for security reasons. Second, he would look into the Dursleys themselves. If they were Muggles caring for a magical child, there should be some record of their preparation for that responsibility, some documentation of the support they would receive from the Ministry. Third, and most delicately, he would try to understand the surveillance authorization itself. Who else might have seen it? What other forms like it might exist? Was Harry Potter the only magical child under this kind of observation, or were there others? The questions multiplied as Arthur wrote, each one leading to 3 more. By the time he heard the first stirrings of movement from upstairs, Percy's careful footsteps in the hallway, followed by the thundering rush of Fred and George racing each other to the bathroom, Arthur had filled 2 pages with notes and queries. He folded the surveillance form carefully and slipped it into the back of his desk drawer, underneath the warranty information for a Muggle television set he'd been studying. The pages of notes went into his coat pocket, disguised among his usual work papers. To anyone else, they would look like routine Ministry business, the kind of bureaucratic follow-up that comprised most of Arthur's official duties. But as Arthur climbed the stairs to kiss his children good morning and pretend that the world was still the safe place it had seemed yesterday, he knew that his real work was just beginning. For somewhere in the maze of Ministry records and official procedures, Harry Potter's story was waiting to be uncovered. And Arthur Weasley, minor civil servant and father of 6, was going to find it, even if he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for what that story might reveal. Chapter 3. Allies in Unexpected Places. 3 days after discovering the surveillance form, Arthur found himself lingering outside the leaky cauldron, watching the evening crowd through windows fogged with November rain and pipe smoke. He'd been trying to work up the courage for this conversation since Tuesday, and now that Friday evening had arrived, he could no longer postpone what felt increasingly like a betrayal of everything he'd been taught to believe about trust and loyalty. The problem was that loyalty, Arthur had discovered, could point in several directions at once. Loyalty to Dumbledore, who had led them through the darkest years of the war and earned the gratitude of every witch and wizard in Britain. Loyalty to the Order, which had bound them all together in common cause against Voldemort's terror. And loyalty to a child he'd never met, whose only crime was surviving when he should have died. Arthur pushed through the tavern door, nodding to Tom behind the bar, and made his way toward the back corner, where Kingsley Shacklebolt sat, nursing a pint of bitter, and reading the Evening Prophet. Even in civilian clothes, Kingsley carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of an aura, alert, controlled, and radiating the kind of quiet competence that had made him invaluable during the war. "Mind if I join you?" Arthur asked, though he was already pulling out the opposite chair. Kingsley looked up from his paper, his dark eyes taking in Arthur's nervous fidgeting with the kind of professional assessment that made Arthur feel transparent. "Arthur, didn't expect to see you here tonight. Everything all right at home? Home's fine. Everyone's well. Arthur settled into his chair and caught Tom's attention long enough to order his own pint. Actually, I was hoping to have a word with you. About work. Ah. Kingsley folded his paper and set it aside. Ministry work or other work? The careful phrasing told Arthur that Kingsley understood exactly what kind of conversation this might be. During the war, they'd all learned to speak in codes and half-meanings, to communicate dangerous truths through careful omission and strategic silence. Old habits, it seemed, had died hard. Both, in a way, Arthur said, accepting his pint with a nod of thanks. I've come across something at the ministry that's been troubling me, something related to recent events. Kingsley's expression didn't change, but Arthur caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way his hands moved fractionally closer to his wand. Recent events cover a lot of ground these days. Arthur took a steadying breath and committed himself to the path he'd been circling for days. I found a surveillance authorization for Harry Potter, comprehensive monitoring, filed the day after his parents died. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Arthur to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. Kingsley stared at him with the flat, unreadable expression Arthur had seen him use on suspected Death Eaters, and for a moment Arthur wondered if his friend, if Kingsley had ever truly been his friend, was about to report him for discussing classified information. Then Kingsley leaned forward and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. What kind of surveillance? Everything. Magical development, psychological assessment, environmental stressor documentation. Arthur kept his own voice equally low, conscious of the other patrons scattered throughout the tavern. Authorized by Dumbledore alone, no expiration date, no oversight. Kingsley was quiet for a long moment, turning his pint glass in slow circles on the scarred wooden table. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Arthur's chest tight. I've been wondering when someone would ask about that. You knew? Not about the surveillance, specifically, but... Kingsley glanced around the tavern, then back to Arthur. There's been talk among the Aurors. Quiet talk, the kind you don't put in official reports, about how quickly the Potter case was closed, how few follow-up investigations were authorized, about who made those decisions and why. Arthur felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one asking uncomfortable questions. What kind of talk? The kind that asks why a case involving the most powerful dark wizard in a generation gets wrapped up in 24 hours with minimal investigation. The kind that wonders who decided where Harry Potter would be placed and what criteria they used. Kingsley took a careful sip of his beer. Or the kind that notices when certain files get classified above your clearance level before you've had a chance to properly review them. Files. Scene analysis from Godric's Hollow, witness statements from the neighbors, background checks on potential guardians. Kingsley's expression was grim. All of it sealed, all of it restricted to a very small circle of people who answer directly to Dumbledore. Arthur stared into his pint, watching the foam settle, and thinking about the implications of what Kingsley was telling him. Do you know where they placed him? With relatives. Muggles in Surrey, that's all I was told. But Arthur... Kingsley leaned even closer, his voice dropping to barely a breath. I ran the placement protocols myself during the war, for the children we had to hide from Death Eaters. Standard procedure requires home visits, background investigations, ongoing support for the guardians. None of that happened with Harry Potter. None of it? Nothing. The placement was made by Dumbledore personally, without consultation or review. No ministry oversight, no social services follow-up, no magical protection beyond. Whatever he arranged privately. Arthur felt sick. The surveillance form in his desk drawer suddenly seemed even more sinister, if that were possible. Kingsley, what if the placement wasn't about protection? What if it was about something else entirely? Kingsley studied Arthur's face for a long moment. What exactly are you asking me? I'm asking if you think it's possible that Harry Potter was placed with people who might not have his best interests at heart. Deliberately. The words hung between them, like an accusation neither of them wanted to voice. Arthur watched Kingsley process the implication, saw the moment when professional skepticism gave way to a darker kind of understanding. "Christ," Kingsley breathed. "You think Dumbledore." He didn't finish the sentence, but Arthur could see the conclusion forming in his friend's eyes. "I don't know what to think," Arthur said honestly. "But I know that surveillance authorization shouldn't exist, and I know that a 1-year-old child shouldn't need monitoring for environmental stresses unless someone expects those stresses to be significant." Kingsley drained half his pint in a single swallow. "What do you want to do about it?" The question Arthur had been dreading. "I want to know if Harry Potter is safe. I want to know who the Dursleys are and why they were chosen. And I want to know if there's anyone else asking these questions besides us." "There might be," Kingsley said slowly. "McGonagall was at the office last week, asking about placement protocols for magical children with Muggle relatives. She seemed troubled about something." Arthur's pulse quickened. If Minerva McGonagall, deputy headmistress of Hogwarts and one of the most formidable witches of their generation, was asking questions about Harry's placement, then perhaps his concerns weren't misplaced after all. "Do you think she'd be willing to talk to us?" "Only one way to find out." Kingsley glanced at his watch. "She's usually in her office Friday evenings, grading papers. We could flu call from the back room if Tom doesn't mind." 20 minutes later, Arthur found himself standing in front of the fireplace in the Leaky Cauldron's private parlour, watching Kingsley toss flu powder into the flames. The green fire flared and settled, and Kingsley knelt to speak into it. "Professor McGonagall, Kingsley Shacklebolt here. I wonder if Arthur Weasley and I might have a word with you about a ministry matter." There was a pause, and then McGonagall's stern voice emerged from the flames. "What sort of ministry matter, Mr. Shacklebolt?" Kingsley glanced at Arthur, who nodded grimly. "The sort that concerns the welfare of Harry Potter." The silence stretched so long that Arthur wondered if the connection had been broken. When McGonagall finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled in a way that suggested barely contained emotion. "I'll meet you at the 3 Broomsticks in an hour. Or come alone." The flames died, leaving them staring at cold ashes and each other. "Well," Kingsley said. That wasn't a no. An hour later, Arthur found himself seated at a corner table in the 3 Broomsticks, watching Professor McGonagall approach with the measured stride that had intimidated generations of Hogwarts students. She looked older than Arthur remembered, as if the war had carved new lines around her eyes and mouth, and there was something brittle in her usually impeccable composure. "Gentlemen," she said, taking the seat across from them without removing her travelling cloak. "You mentioned Harry Potter's welfare. I assume you have good reason for disturbing me on a Friday evening with such a topic." Arthur pulled the surveillance form from his coat pocket, unfolded it carefully, and slid it across the table. McGonagall's eyes swept over it once, then again more slowly, and Arthur watched her face go completely still. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was misfiled in my department's paperwork," Arthur said. "Filed the day after James and Lily died." McGonagall stared at the form for a long moment, then looked up at them with eyes that held a terrible kind of recognition. "I was there that night," she said quietly. "November 1st. I watched the Dursleys all day, observing from the garden wall in my cat form." Arthur's heart clenched. And they are the worst sort of muggles imaginable. Petunia Dursley spent the morning gossiping with her neighbours about the freaks next door, while her husband complained loudly about people who don't conform to proper standards. "That their son is a spoiled bully who destroys other children's toys for sport." McGonagall's voice grew more controlled with each word, which somehow made it more damning than shouting would have been. "I told Dumbledore they were unsuitable. I begged him to reconsider. I suggested a dozen other families who would have welcomed Harry with open arms. She folded the surveillance form carefully and pushed it back toward Arthur. He told me that Harry's placement was not my concern, and that I should trust his judgment in all things. Kingsley leaned forward. But you don't trust his judgment in this. I haven't been able to sleep properly since that night, McGonagall admitted. I keep thinking about that little boy, alone in a house with people who will never understand what he is or what he's been through, at people who resent his very existence. Arthur felt something click into place in his mind. The environmental stressor documentation, he said. It's not meant to protect him from stress. It's meant to record it. McGonagall's face went white. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Harry Potter wasn't placed with the Dursleys for his protection, Arthur said, voicing the terrible suspicion that had been growing in his mind for days. He was placed with them because someone wanted him to suffer. Someone wanted him isolated, unloved, and broken down. And someone wanted every moment of that suffering carefully documented. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, Arthur could hear the normal sounds of Hogsmeade on a Friday evening, laughter from other patrons, the clink of glasses, the comfortable murmur of conversation. But inside their corner of the tavern, 3 adults sat staring at each other, while the implications of what they'd discovered settled around them like a curse. Finally, McGonagall spoke, her voice sharp with the kind of anger that could reduce grown wizards to stammering children. If what you're suggesting is true, then we have a moral obligation to act. Even if it means going against Dumbledore? Kingsley asked. McGonagall's smile was thin and completely without humour. Mr. Shacklebolt, I have spent 30 years watching that man make decisions he claims are for the greater good. I have trusted his judgment in matters large and small, even when that judgment seemed questionable. But if he has deliberately placed a child in harm's way for his own purposes, then Albus Dumbledore will discover that my loyalty has limits. She stood, wrapping her travelling cloak more tightly around her shoulders. I suggest we meet again next week to discuss our next steps. And gentlemen, I suggest we keep this conversation between the 3 of us for now. If we're right about what's happening to Harry Potter, then we're going to need to be very careful about whom we trust. Arthur watched her leave, then turned to Kingsley. Are we doing the right thing? I don't know, Kingsley said honestly. But I know we can't do nothing. Not if there's even a chance that Harry Potter is suffering while we stand by and let it happen. Arthur nodded and carefully folded the surveillance form back into his pocket. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows of the 3 broomsticks, and somewhere in Surrey, a little boy was sleeping in a house where he was neither wanted nor loved. But at least now, Arthur thought, he wasn't sleeping there alone. 3 adults who barely knew him were asking questions about his welfare, and that had to count for something. It had to be a beginning. Chapter 4. The Dursley investigation. Arthur had never appreciated how useful his fascination with Muggle technology could be until he found himself crouched behind a garden hedge on Privet Drive at 7:30 on a grey November morning, adjusting the focus on a pair of Muggle binoculars he'd purchased in London the day before. The street was precisely what he'd expected from McGonagall's description, immaculately maintained, aggressively ordinary, and populated by the sort of people who measured their worth in property values and perfectly trimmed hedges. Number 4 stood out only for how desperately it tried not to stand out. The lawn was marginally greener than its neighbours, the doorbell marginally more polished, the curtains marginally more pristine. It was the home of people who had built their entire lives around the principle of being better than everyone else while appearing exactly the same. Arthur shifted his weight carefully, conscious of every sound in the morning stillness. 3 houses down, a tabby cat sat on a garden wall with the kind of alert stillness that suggested it was paying very close attention to everything happening on the street. McGonagall had been in position since before dawn, and Arthur had to admire her patience. He'd been watching for less than an hour, and already felt stiff from crouching. The front door of number 4 opened with a sharp click that carried clearly in the morning air. Vernon Dursley emerged first, a massive man whose purple face suggested either high blood pressure or perpetual outrage, possibly both. He wore a suit that strained across his considerable bulk and carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't shout into submission. Petunia Dursley followed, her angular frame draped in a housecoat that managed to look both expensive and somehow cheap. She had the kind of face that seemed designed for disapproval, all sharp angles and pinched features, and she wielded it like a weapon as she surveyed her perfect street with obvious satisfaction. "Remember, Petunia," Vernon's voice boomed across the quiet neighborhood. "Not a word about the boy to anyone. Far as they're concerned, we've got a sickly nephew staying with us temporarily. But nothing more. Of course, Vernon." Petunia's voice was thin and reedy, like wind through a badly fitted window, though I don't see why we couldn't have sent him to an orphanage. Surely there are places for children like him. "Because Dumbledore was quite clear about our obligations," Vernon snapped, his face darkening further. "We keep the boy, we don't ask questions, and we don't make trouble. In exchange, they stay out of our lives." Arthur felt his stomach clench. They. As if Harry Potter were part of some invading force, rather than a toddler who'd lost his parents. Vernon squeezed himself into a car that seemed far too small for his bulk, while Petunia retreated into the house. Arthur waited until the car had disappeared around the corner, before pulling out a small notebook and making his first entry of the day. 7:35 a.m. V. Mustn't P. Dursley discussing Harry's presence as if it were a burden to be endured rather than a child to be cared for. No mention of his well-being or needs. V referenced obligations and staying out of their lives, suggesting arrangement with magical authorities, Dumbledore. Arthur had spent enough time in the ministry to know the importance of documentation. If they were going to challenge Dumbledore's placement of Harry, they would need evidence that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Personal observations, dates, times, direct quotations, the kind of meticulous record-keeping that could stand up to official scrutiny. Movement at an upstairs window caught his attention. Arthur raised the binoculars and felt his heart sink at what he saw. Now Harry Potter, unmistakable even at a distance because of his distinctive black hair and the thin frame that spoke of poor nutrition, was standing in what appeared to be a small bedroom, his hands pressed against the glass. He was larger than Arthur had expected, old enough to walk and presumably to understand at least some of what was happening around him, but there was something about his posture that suggested resignation rather than curiosity. As Arthur watched, Harry turned away from the window and disappeared from view. A few moments later, Arthur heard what sounded like shouting from inside the house, though he couldn't make out the words. The tabby cat on the garden wall stood, stretched with feline deliberation, and began picking its way carefully toward number 4. Arthur understood. McGonagall was moving closer for reconnaissance. Arthur spent the next 2 hours documenting everything he observed. Petunia hanging washing on the line, while muttering angrily under her breath about ungrateful children and freakish behavior. A neighbor stopping by to chat over the garden fence, during which Petunia spoke in saccharine tones about her difficult nephew, who was quite sickly, you know, and rather disturbed by his parents' accident. The mailman delivering letters, including several official-looking envelopes that Petunia snatched up quickly and took inside without opening. Most disturbing of all was the pattern Arthur began to notice in the sounds coming from the house. Periods of relative quiet, broken by sharp voices, slamming doors, and what sounded unmistakably like a child crying. But the crying never lasted long. It was always cut off abruptly, as if someone were enforcing silence rather than providing comfort. By mid-morning, Arthur had filled 6 pages with observations, and his certainty that something was deeply wrong had crystallized into a cold, hard knot of anger in his chest. He was preparing to leave when he spotted a woman approaching from the opposite direction, walking a small dog and moving with the kind of deliberate casualness that suggested surveillance training. Arthur recognized Arabella Figg immediately, though he'd only met her once during an order meeting early in the war. She was a squib who'd been useful for monitoring Muggle areas where full-blooded wizards might attract unwanted attention. What was she doing on Privet Drive? Arthur watched Mrs. Figg walk past number 4, her eyes taking in every detail of the house and garden with professional thoroughness. She paused to let her cat investigate something near the Dursleys' front gate, during which time she appeared to be listening intently to whatever sounds might be coming from inside the house. When she continued on her way, Arthur made another note in his book. A. Figg conducting surveillance of number 4. Possible connection to official monitoring of Harry's placement. How long has this been in place? The implications were staggering. If Arabella Figg was watching the Dursleys on someone's behalf, almost certainly Dumbledore's, then there was already an established surveillance network around Harry Potter. The form Arthur had found wasn't authorization for new monitoring. It was documentation of operations that were already underway. But operations that, based on Mrs. Figg's presence, had been planned well in advance of James and Lily's deaths. Arthur carefully packed away his binoculars and notebook, then made his way back toward the apparition point he'd established in a small copse of trees several streets away. He needed to compare notes with McGonagall and Kingsley, and he needed to do it quickly. What they'd discovered this morning changed everything. 2 hours later, Arthur found himself back in the private parlour at the Leaky Cauldron, facing McGonagall and Kingsley across a table that seemed too small to contain the magnitude of what they'd learned. "The child is being deliberately isolated," McGonagall said without preamble, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "I spent 4 hours in cat form, moving around the house and garden, listening to everything I could hear through open windows and doors." "And?" Kingsley prompted, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Harry Potter is being treated as a burden and a threat, rather than a child in need of care. He's kept in a small bedroom on the upper floor for most of the day. When he makes noise, and he's barely more than a baby, so of course he makes noise, Petunia Dursley shouts at him to keep quiet and stop being freakish." McGonagall's hands clenched into fists on the table. "I heard her tell him that his parents were drunks who died in a car crash because they were too irresponsible to take care of themselves." Arthur felt sick. She's lying to him about how his parents died. She's telling him that his parents were worthless and that he's lucky the Dursleys are willing to put up with him at all. McGonagall's voice was deadly quiet now, which somehow made it more frightening than shouting would have been. "She's systematically destroying that child's sense of worth and belonging." Kingsley leaned forward. "What about physical care? Is he being fed properly? Clothed? Given medical attention when needed?" "The bare minimum to keep him alive and reasonably healthy," McGonagall replied. "But there's no affection, no comfort, no recognition that he's a child who's lost everything he's ever known. They're housing him, or not raising him." Arthur pulled out his notebook and shared his own observations, the conversation he'd overheard about obligations and arrangements, the pattern of crying that was always quickly silenced, the official-looking mail that Petunia had been so quick to hide. "And there's something else," he added reluctantly. Arabella Figg was there, conducting what looked like professional surveillance of the house. The silence that followed was deafening. "Mrs. Figg," Kingsley said slowly. "The squib who worked with the Order?" "The same. Which means Dumbledore has had people watching Harry Potter since the day he was placed there. Possibly before." Arthur met both their eyes in turn. "The surveillance authorization I found wasn't requesting new monitoring. It was documenting operations that were already in place." McGonagall stood abruptly and began pacing the small confines of the parlour. "Do you understand what this means? Dumbledore placed Harry with people he knew would mistreat him, then established a surveillance network to document that mistreatment. This isn't neglect or poor judgment. It's deliberate." "But why?" Arthur asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. What possible reason could there be for wanting Harry Potter to suffer? Kingsley was quiet for a long moment, his expression grim. "There's a theory among some of the older Aurors," he said finally, "about what happens to children who survive dark magic, about how trauma can shape magical development in specific ways." "What kind of ways?" McGonagall demanded. "Ways that make them more susceptible to control, more dependent on authority figures who offer them protection and guidance." Kingsley's voice was carefully neutral, but Arthur could hear the disgust underneath. Ways that make them grateful for any kindness, no matter how conditional. Arthur stared at his friends and felt the last of his faith in Albus Dumbledore crumble into dust. "You're saying Dumbledore is deliberately traumatizing Harry Potter, so he'll be easier to manipulate later." "I'm saying it's a possibility we have to consider," Kingsley replied, "especially given what we've observed today." McGonagall stopped pacing and faced them both, her expression harder than Arthur had ever seen it. "Then we have our answer about what we need to do next. We need to document everything we've discovered, and we need to present it to people who have the authority to override Dumbledore's placement decision." "Who would that be?" Arthur asked. "The Wizengamot has ultimate authority over child welfare cases involving magical children," McGonagall said. "But getting a hearing would require filing formal charges of child endangerment against both the Dursleys and whoever authorized the placement." "Dumbledore," Kingsley said grimly. "We'd be filing charges against Albus Dumbledore." Arthur thought of Harry Potter standing at that upstairs window, small and alone, and already learning that the world was a place where he wasn't wanted. He thought of his own children, safe and loved at the Burrow, and what Molly would do to anyone who treated them the way Harry was being treated. "Then that's what we do," he said quietly. "We file the charges, and we get Harry Potter away from those people before they destroy him completely." McGonagall nodded sharply. "I'll begin preparing the formal documentation. Kingsley, can you research the legal procedures for challenging a high-level ministry placement decision?" "Already on it," Kingsley replied. "And Arthur, we're going to need more evidence, more documentation, more witnesses, more proof that this is happening deliberately, rather than through simple neglect." Arthur stood, feeling the weight of what they were about to undertake, settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. They were preparing to challenge the most powerful wizard in Britain, to accuse him of crimes that would destroy his reputation and possibly land him in Azkaban. They were risking their careers, their freedom, and possibly their lives. But somewhere in Surrey, a little boy was learning to believe that he deserved to be unloved, and that was a risk Arthur Weasley was willing to take. "I'll get the evidence," he said. "Whatever it takes." Outside, November rain began to fall against the windows of the leaky cauldron, and Arthur wondered if Harry Potter was standing at his window again, watching the world he'd never truly be allowed to join. Chapter 5. The Headmaster's Web. Arthur had always prided himself on his ability to navigate the ministry's labyrinthine filing systems, but he'd never before attempted to breach the security of files that weren't meant for his eyes. Standing in the dimly lit archives beneath the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at midnight on a Tuesday, surrounded by towers of dusty case files and the musty smell of old parchment, Arthur wondered if this was how criminals felt just before they were caught. The surveillance authorization for Harry Potter had been filed incorrectly, which was what had brought it to Arthur's attention in the first place. But incorrect filing, Arthur was beginning to understand, might not have been an accident. Over the past week, he'd discovered 3 more surveillance orders misfiled in various departments throughout the ministry, all bearing Dumbledore's signature, all lacking proper authorization protocols, and all concerning children who had lost their parents during the war. The Clearwater girl, whose parents had been killed in a Death Eater attack on St. Mungo's. The youngest Creevy boy, orphaned when his father was murdered for refusing to give up information about Muggle-born hiding places. A pair of siblings named Bones, whose parents had been killed in a raid on their safe house, leaving only their Aunt Amelia to care for them. All children, all orphans, all being watched. Arthur pulled the fourth file toward him and opened it carefully. Susan Bones, aged 3. Surveillance authorized November 15th, 1981. The scope was similar to Harry's: comprehensive monitoring of magical development, psychological evaluation, social interaction assessment. But unlike Harry's file, this one included a notation that made Arthur's blood run cold. Subject to be removed from current guardianship if psychological development proceeds outside acceptable parameters. Removed from Amelia Bones, who loved her niece and had fought alongside Arthur in the Order. Removed and placed where? With whom? And what constituted acceptable parameters for a 3-year-old's psychological development. Arthur photographed the document with a Muggle camera, another piece of technology his colleagues mocked, but which was proving invaluable for gathering evidence that couldn't be magically traced, then returned it to its file. He was preparing to leave when he heard footsteps echoing in the corridor outside the archives. Arthur extinguished his wand light and pressed himself against the wall behind a filing cabinet, his heart hammering loud enough that he was certain whoever was approaching would hear it. The footsteps paused outside the archive door, and Arthur held his breath as he heard the soft click of a key in the lock. The door opened, and Kingsley Shacklebolt stepped into the room, his own wand providing a dim glow that cast strange shadows among the file towers. "Arthur?" Kingsley's voice was barely a whisper. I saw the light under the door. Arthur stepped out from behind the filing cabinet, weak with relief. "Christ, Kingsley, you nearly gave me a heart attack." "What are you doing here?" Kingsley looked around the archives with professional interest. "This isn't exactly your usual territory." "Looking for more surveillance authorizations?" Arthur gestured to the files spread across the nearest table. "I found 4 more, all for war orphans, all signed by Dumbledore alone." Kingsley approached the table and examined Arthur's findings with the methodical attention of an experienced aura. When he finished reading, his expression was grim. "Arthur, these aren't just surveillance orders. Look at the authorization codes." Arthur peered at the parchment where Kingsley was pointing. In small print at the bottom of each document was a series of numbers and letters that he'd previously ignored as routine, bureaucratic notation. "These are intervention protocols," Kingsley explained. "The codes authorize removal of the subjects from their current situations if specific triggers are met. Dumbledore isn't just watching these children, he's positioning himself to take control of them." The implications hit Arthur like a physical blow. How many children? I don't know, but I can tell you that I've been asking questions at the office about post-war child placement procedures, and I'm getting some very interesting answers. Kingsley leaned against the table, his voice dropping even lower. "But 3 different auras have mentioned being instructed to observe and not interfere with certain orphaned children. 2 have been asked to file reports on the suitability of various guardians, and everyone who's asked about the criteria for these assessments has been told it's classified above their clearance level." Arthur felt sick. He's evaluating all of them, looking for reasons to justify taking them away from families who love them. That's what it looks like. "But Arthur..." "There's more." Kingsley pulled out his own file from inside his robes. "I've been researching the legal framework for what Dumbledore is doing, and I found something disturbing. There's a provision in the Emergency Powers Act from 1979 that allows the Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot to assume guardianship of any magical child deemed at risk during times of national crisis." "But the war is over," Arthur protested. "Is it?" Kingsley's smile was bitter. Who determines when a national crisis ends? Who decides whether the threat has truly passed? And what constitutes being at risk? Physical danger, or something more subjective like psychological instability, or unsuitable magical development? Arthur stared at the surveillance files scattered across the table and felt the scope of what they were uncovering expand beyond anything he'd imagined. This wasn't just about Harry Potter. But this was about Dumbledore positioning himself to control an entire generation of war orphans, children who would be grateful for his protection, dependent on his guidance, and shaped by his vision of what the wizarding world should become. "We need to tell McGonagall," Arthur said. "Tonight." An hour later, Arthur and Kingsley stood in Minerva McGonagall's office at Hogwarts, watching her pace behind her desk with the controlled fury of a caged predator. The surveillance files were spread across her desk like accusations, and her face had gone through several alarming color changes as she'd read through each one. 17 children, she said, her voice deadly quiet. "I found records for 17 children in Dumbledore's personal files, all of them orphaned during the war, but all of them now subject to what he calls protective oversight." Arthur sank into one of the chairs facing her desk. 17. Children whose parents died fighting Voldemort. Children who should be safe now, being raised by loving relatives or adoptive families. McGonagall stopped pacing and faced them, her eyes blazing. Instead, they're all living under surveillance, their guardians subjected to regular evaluation visits, their magical development monitored and documented as if they were experimental subjects, rather than traumatized children trying to heal. Kingsley leaned forward. "What kind of documentation?" "Monthly reports on their emotional state, their magical abilities, their relationships with their guardians, and notes on any signs of concerning independence or resistance to authority. Detailed analysis of their psychological vulnerabilities and how those might be leveraged." McGonagall's voice grew more controlled with each word, which somehow made it more frightening. Arthur thought of his own children and felt rage building in his chest like a physical pressure. This has to be illegal. Even under emergency powers, there have to be limits. "There should be," McGonagall agreed. "But Dumbledore has been very careful about how he's structured this program. The surveillance is authorized under national security provisions. The evaluations are framed as child welfare assessments. The intervention protocols are presented as protection measures for vulnerable children." "But they're not," Kingsley said flatly. "No, yet they're tools for identifying and controlling the next generation of magical leaders." McGonagall moved to the window overlooking the Hogwarts grounds, her reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. "Think about it. 17 children, all with powerful magical parents who died fighting for the light. Children who will one day be influential adults in their own right. What better way to ensure they serve your vision of the wizarding world than to shape them from childhood?" Arthur stood and joined her at the window, staring out at the lake that reflected the castle's lights like scattered stars. "We have to stop this." "How?" McGonagall's voice was tired now, weighted down by the enormity of what they were facing. "Dumbledore has legal authority for everything he's doing. He has the support of the Wizengamot, the gratitude of the wizarding world, and the protection of his reputation as the man who saved us all from Voldemort." "We have evidence," Kingsley said from behind them. "Documentation of surveillance without proper authorization, intervention protocols that exceed legal boundaries, systematic manipulation of child placement procedures. Evidence that we obtained by breaking into restricted ministry files and searching Dumbledore's private records without his knowledge," McGonagall pointed out. "Evidence that could be dismissed as the desperate accusations of people who are clearly conducting illegal activities themselves." Arthur turned away from the window and faced his companions. "So what are you suggesting? That we just let him continue?" "I'm suggesting that we need to be very careful about how we proceed," McGonagall said. "Poor Dumbledore didn't build this system overnight, and he won't abandon it just because we ask him nicely. If we're going to challenge him, we need to be prepared for a fight that could destroy us all." Kingsley stood and gathered the surveillance files into a neat stack. "Then we'd better make sure we win." Arthur nodded, though the weight of what they were contemplating settled on his shoulders like a lead cloak. They weren't just challenging a single decision about Harry Potter's placement anymore. They were preparing to expose a systematic program of child manipulation orchestrated by the most powerful wizard in Britain. And they were 3 people, a minor ministry employee, an auror, and a schoolteacher, standing against a man who had the resources of the wizarding world at his disposal and the reputation of a savior to protect him. But somewhere in Surrey, Harry Potter was learning to believe he deserved to be unloved. Somewhere else, 16 other children were growing up under the watchful eyes of people who saw them as tools rather than human beings. And that, Arthur decided, was worth any risk. "We'll need allies," he said. "People in positions of authority who can't be easily dismissed or discredited." "Amelia Bones," McGonagall said immediately. "She's head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and her niece is on Dumbledore's list. If anyone has the motivation and the authority to challenge this program, it's her." "And we'll need more evidence," Kingsley added, "the kind that can't be dismissed as fabricated or obtained illegally. Official testimonies, documented violations of established protocols, to proof that children are being harmed rather than protected." Arthur thought of Harry Potter standing at that upstairs window, small and alone, and already learning the world's cruelest lessons. Then that's what we'll get. Whatever it takes. Outside, snow began to fall across the Hogwarts grounds, coating the world in white silence. But in McGonagall's office, 3 people sat in the warm glow of candlelight and planned a war against the man who had taught them all what it meant to fight for what was right. The irony, Arthur thought, was that Dumbledore himself had trained them too well. He'd taught them that some principles were worth any sacrifice, that protecting the innocent was more important than protecting yourself, and that sometimes the greatest enemy of good was someone who believed their vision of the greater good justified any means necessary. Now they were going to use those lessons against their teacher, and somehow Arthur was certain that Dumbledore would be proud of them for it, right up until the moment they brought his carefully constructed web of manipulation crashing down around him. Chapter 6. The Order Divided. The Hog's Head Inn had seen better decades, but its grimy windows and suspicious clientele made it perfect for conversations that couldn't happen in more respectable establishments. Arthur sat at a corner table that wobbled alarmingly whenever he moved, watching Hagrid's massive frame fill the doorway as the gamekeeper ducked through the entrance with his usual careful politeness. "Arthur, Kingsley, Professor McGonagall," Hagrid rumbled, settling onto a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. "Got your message? Said it was urgent, about some order business?" Arthur exchanged glances with his companions. They'd spent hours debating how to approach the other Order members, how much to reveal, and whom to trust with the evidence they'd gathered. Hagrid had seemed like a natural choice. He'd known Harry's parents well. He cared deeply about children, and his loyalty was absolute. The problem, Arthur was beginning to realize, was that Hagrid's loyalty was absolute to Dumbledore first, and everyone else a distant second. "Hagrid," McGonagall began carefully, "what do you know about where Harry Potter has been placed?" Hagrid's beetle-black eyes lit up with genuine warmth. With his aunt and uncle, safe as houses, or Professor Dumbledore saw to it, personally, he did. Poor little Tyke's in the best possible hands. "Have you seen him since the placement?" Kingsley asked. "Visited to check on his well-being?" "Well, no," Hagrid admitted, looking slightly confused. But Professor Dumbledore said it was important to let the family settle in private-like. Give 'em time to adjust to having a magical child in the house. He leaned forward conspirationally. "Besides, there's protective measures in place, aren't there? Can't be too careful with you-know-whose supporters still out there." Arthur felt his stomach sink. "What kind of protective measures?" "Well, I don't know the details, do I?" Hagrid's voice carried a note of reproach, as if Arthur were questioning something that should be taken on faith. "Professor Dumbledore handles all that sort of thing, but he's got it all worked out, down to the last detail." McGonagall leaned forward. "Hagrid, we've discovered some concerning information about Harry's placement, the family he's been placed with. They're not suitable guardians for any child, let alone one who's lost his parents." Hagrid's expression immediately became defensive. "Now see here, Professor McGonagall. With all due respect, I'm sure Professor Dumbledore knows what he's doing. He's the smartest wizard alive, isn't he? If he says Harry's safe, then Harry's safe." Arthur pulled out the surveillance authorization and placed it on the table between them. "Hagrid, look at this. This is a surveillance order for Harry Potter, filed the day after his parents died. Look at the scope of monitoring authorized." Hagrid squinted at the parchment, his lips moving slightly as he read. When he finished, he pushed it back toward Arthur with a dismissive gesture. "Well, of course, Professor Dumbledore's keeping an eye on Harry. The boy's famous, isn't he? Bound to attract all sorts of attention. Makes perfect sense to make sure he's protected." "This isn't protection," Kingsley said firmly. "This is surveillance for the purpose of documenting environmental stresses. That means they're watching for signs that Harry is being mistreated, not preventing the mistreatment from happening." Hagrid's face grew increasingly stubborn. "You're reading too much into it. Professor Dumbledore would never let any harm come to Harry Potter. Never. He loved James and Lily like they were his own children." "Then why won't he let anyone else visit Harry?" Arthur asked. "Why are all the placement files classified? Why has he blocked adoption applications from other families?" "Because," Hagrid said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child, "Professor Dumbledore knows what's best for the boy. Harry's got special needs, special circumstances. Can't just place him with anyone who asks, can you?" The conversation continued in circles for another 20 minutes, with Hagrid growing more defensive and more entrenched in his position with each piece of evidence they presented. Finally, he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I won't sit here and listen to you lot accuse Professor Dumbledore of whatever it is you're accusing him of," Hagrid said, his voice tight with hurt and anger. "He's a great man, the greatest wizard of our time. If you can't see that, then maybe you're not the people I thought you were." Hagrid left without another word, ducking through the doorway and disappearing into the November darkness. Arthur stared at the empty chair and felt the first crack in what he'd hoped would be a unified front. "Well," McGonagall said dryly, "that went better than expected." "Did it?" Arthur asked. "I expected him to report back to Dumbledore immediately. The fact that he just stormed off in a huff suggests he's at least conflicted about what we've told him." McGonagall folded the surveillance authorization and tucked it back into her robes. "Hagrid's loyalty runs deep, but it's not entirely blind. He'll think about what we've said, even if he doesn't want to." Their next meeting was arranged for the following evening, in a different location with a different Order member. Remus Lupin had agreed to meet them at a small tea room in Diagon Alley, though he'd sounded reluctant and tired over the flu connection. Arthur found Lupin already waiting when they arrived, seated at a table in the back corner, with his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The war had aged him badly. His brown hair was streaked with premature grey, his robes were patched and threadbare, and there was a hollowness around his eyes that spoke of too many losses and too little hope. "Arthur." "Kingsley, Minerva," Lupin said quietly, rising to greet them with the careful politeness of someone who wasn't sure he was welcome anywhere. "Thank you for agreeing to meet somewhere less conspicuous." They settled around the small table, and Arthur was struck by how different this felt from their conversation with Hagrid. Where Hagrid had been defensive and dismissive, Lupin seemed tired and wary, as if he'd already guessed that whatever they wanted to discuss would only add to his burdens. "Remus," McGonagall said gently, "we asked you here because we've discovered some concerning information about Harry Potter's placement. Information that suggests he may not be as safe or as well cared for as we've been told." Lupin's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went pale, and his hands clenched into fists on the table. "What do you mean?" Arthur explained their discoveries carefully, showing Lupin the surveillance authorization and describing what they'd observed at Privet Drive. Unlike Hagrid, Lupin read through everything with careful attention, but asking pointed questions about the legal framework and the scope of monitoring. When Arthur finished, Lupin was quiet for a long moment, staring into his cold tea with an expression of profound sadness. "I've been wondering," he said finally, "why I wasn't allowed to see Harry after the placement. I asked, begged actually, to be allowed to visit. Dumbledore told me that it would be inappropriate for someone in my condition to have contact with James and Lily's son." Arthur felt anger flare in his chest. "Because you're a werewolf?" "Because I'm a dangerous creature who can't be trusted around children," Lupin said with bitter precision. Those were his exact words. He said that Harry needed stability and normalcy, not reminders of the magical world's darker elements. McGonagall made a sound of disgust. "Remus, you were one of James and Lily's closest friends. You knew Harry as a baby. You have more right than almost anyone to be part of his life." "Apparently not." Lupin's smile was hollow. "But what you're telling me suggests that my dangerous influence was less of a concern than my potential interference with whatever Dumbledore has planned for Harry." Kingsley leaned forward. "Will you help us? We're gathering evidence to challenge the placement, but we need people who can testify to the bonds Harry had with his parents' friends, people who could provide him with love and stability." Lupin was quiet again, and Arthur could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Finally, he looked up at them with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror. "If what you're suggesting is true, if Dumbledore has deliberately placed Harry with people who will mistreat him, then yes, I'll help you. But you need to understand something." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I have nothing left to lose. No job, no home, no prospects for either. If I go against Dumbledore and fail, I'll have nowhere to turn. But if I don't try to help Harry and something happens to him, I'll never forgive myself." Arthur reached across the table and gripped Lupin's shoulder. "We won't let you face this alone, Remus. Whatever happens, we'll make sure you have support." "You can't promise that," Lupin said sadly. "None of us know what we're walking into." The third meeting took place 2 days later, in the back room of Flourish and Blots, after closing hours. That Emmeline Vance and Sturgis Podmore had agreed to hear them out, though both seemed sceptical and uncomfortable about the secretive nature of the gathering. Emmeline, a sharp-featured witch who worked in the Department of Mysteries, listened to their presentation with professional detachment before asking pointed questions about their evidence-gathering methods and legal standing. Sturgis, a member of the Wizengamot, focused on the political implications of challenging Dumbledore's authority. "Even if everything you're saying is true," Emmeline said when they'd finished their presentation, "what you're describing isn't technically illegal. Dumbledore has been granted extraordinary authority in matters of national security, and child placement falls under that umbrella during times of crisis." "The crisis is over," Arthur protested. "Voldemort is gone." "Is he?" Sturgis asked quietly. "His body was never found. His supporters are still at large. Many people believe this is just a lull in the conflict, not an ending." He steepled his fingers and regarded them thoughtfully. "I'm not saying I agree with everything Dumbledore has done, but I understand the reasoning behind maintaining emergency protocols." Arthur felt frustration building in his chest. "So we just accept that children are being systematically monitored and manipulated because it might serve some theoretical greater good?" "I'm saying," Sturgis replied carefully, "that challenging Dumbledore publicly would require evidence of actual harm, not just questionable methodology. And frankly, the three of you don't have the political standing to make such accusations credible." Emmeline nodded reluctantly. "If you want to help Harry Potter, your best option might be to work within the system, rather than trying to tear it down." The meeting ended with polite expressions of concern and promises to keep an eye on the situation. But Arthur could tell that neither Emmeline nor Sturgis would be joining their cause. They were too cautious, too invested in the existing power structures to risk everything on what they saw as a moral crusade with little chance of success. That night, Arthur returned home to the burrow feeling defeated and isolated. The kitchen was warm and welcoming as always, filled with the comforting smells of Molly's cooking and the soft sounds of his family settling into their evening routines. But for the first time in his marriage, Arthur felt like an intruder in his own home. "You're home late again," Molly said, though not looking up from the potatoes she was peeling for tomorrow's dinner. "The children were asking for you." "Ministry work," Arthur said, which was becoming his standard excuse for increasingly frequent absences. Molly set down her knife and turned to face him, her brown eyes serious. "Arthur, what's going on? And don't tell me it's just work. You've been distracted and secretive for weeks. You barely eat, you're having nightmares. And yesterday I found surveillance notes hidden in your desk drawer." Arthur's blood turned to ice. "You went through my desk." "I was looking for stamps to post a letter to my mother, and I found pages of notes about someone called Harry Potter and references to child welfare violations." Molly crossed her arms over her chest. "Now, are you going to tell me what's happening, or am I going to have to guess?" Arthur looked at his wife, the woman he loved more than his own life, the mother of his children, his partner in everything that mattered, and realized that his attempt to protect her from the ugliness of what he'd discovered had only succeeded in pushing her away. "Sit down," he said quietly. "There's something I need to tell you." Arthur explained everything. The surveillance authorization, the investigation, the evidence they'd gathered about Harry Potter's mistreatment. He told her about the 17 children under observation, about Dumbledore's systematic manipulation of child placements, about the growing realization that the war's end had simply transformed the battlefield rather than eliminating it. When he finished, Molly was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "This little boy," she said finally. "Harry Potter. He's the same age as Ron? A few months older. 15 months, maybe 16 now." Molly's eyes filled with tears. "Arthur, how could anyone treat a baby that way? How could anyone watch it happen and do nothing?" "I don't know," Arthur said honestly, "but I'm trying to stop it." Molly stood up and moved to the window, staring out at their garden where their own children played safely every day. "What can I do to help?" Arthur felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I was hoping you'd ask that. Those people you've been working with, McGonagall and Kingsley, do they understand what they're up against?" "I think so." "But Molly, if we do this, if we really challenge Dumbledore, there will be consequences. For all of us. He has the power to destroy careers, to make life very difficult for anyone who opposes him." Molly turned back to face him, and Arthur was struck by the fierce determination in her expression. "Arthur Weasley, I have 6 children of my own. The idea that someone could hurt a child the way you've described and get away with it because they're powerful enough to silence anyone who objects, that makes me angrier than I've ever been in my life." She moved to the kitchen table and sat down across from him, reaching for his hands. "If there's a little boy out there who needs protecting, then we protect him. Whatever the cost." Arthur squeezed her hands and felt, for the first time in weeks, that he wasn't facing this alone. The Order might be divided. Other people might be too afraid or too invested in the status quo to act. But he had his wife beside him. And sometimes, Arthur reflected, that was enough to change the world. Outside, November wind rattled the windows of the burrow, but inside, 2 parents who understood the sacred duty of protecting children began planning how to save one they'd never met from the man who was supposed to be his greatest protector. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The gargoyle guarding the entrance to Dumbledore's office had never looked more imposing to Arthur than it did on this grey December morning, its stone eyes seeming to follow him with malevolent interest as he, McGonagall, and Kingsley approached the spiral staircase. Arthur's hands were steady, but his stomach felt as though he'd swallowed a bowtruckle that was trying to claw its way back out. "Chocolate frogs," McGonagall said crisply, and the gargoyle stepped aside with what Arthur swore was reluctant disapproval. The circular office at the top of the stairs was exactly as Arthur remembered from his brief visit years ago during his Hogwarts days, walls lined with portraits of sleeping former headmasters, shelves crowded with mysterious silver instruments, and Fawkes the Phoenix perched regally on his stand. But today, the familiar warmth of the space felt oppressive rather than welcoming, as if the very air were thick with secrets. Albus Dumbledore sat behind his desk with his hands steepled before him, his blue eyes twinkling with what might have been amusement, or might have been something considerably less benign. He wore robes of deep purple that seemed to shimmer in the morning light streaming through the tall windows, and his long silver beard was neatly arranged over his chest like a badge of office. "Arthur, Kingsley, Minerva," he said pleasantly, as if this were a social call rather than a confrontation that could destroy them all. "Please, sit down. I believe you have some concerns you wish to discuss." Arthur remained standing, his jaw set with determination. "Professor Dumbledore, we've come to talk about Harry Potter." "Ah." Dumbledore's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a calculation, perhaps, or a measurement of threat levels. "And what about young Harry concerns you?" McGonagall moved to stand beside Arthur, her posture rigid, with barely controlled anger. "We know about the surveillance, Albus. We know about the systematic monitoring of war orphans, the intervention protocols, the blocked adoption applications. We know what you've been doing." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming softly against his desk. When he spoke, his voice carried the same gentle tone he might use to explain a complex transfiguration concept to a struggling student. "I see. And what exactly do you believe I have been doing?" Kingsley stepped forward, his aura training evident in his controlled posture and measured words. "We believe you have deliberately placed Harry Potter with guardians you knew would mistreat him, then established surveillance to document that mistreatment for your own purposes." "My own purposes," Dumbledore repeated thoughtfully. "How interesting. And what purposes might those be?" Arthur felt anger flare in his chest at Dumbledore's calm demeanor, his refusal to show even a flicker of shame or defensiveness. "Control. You wanted Harry isolated, dependent, grateful for any kindness shown to him. You wanted to shape him from childhood to be your perfect weapon in whatever war you think is coming next." Dumbledore's smile was sad and infinitely patient. "Arthur, my dear boy, you speak as if I have acted from malice rather than necessity, as if I have choices that others do not." "Everyone has choices," McGonagall said sharply. "You chose to place a traumatized child with people who would hurt him. You chose to prevent him from living with people who would love him. You chose to turn his childhood into a calculated experiment." "Did I?" Dumbledore rose from his chair and moved to stand before the tall windows, his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, Minerva, what do you know about blood magic?" McGonagall's expression flickered with uncertainty. "What does that have to do with everything?" Dumbledore interrupted gently. "You see, when Lily Potter died to save her son, she created a protection that runs deeper than any spell or ward. Her sacrifice lives on in Harry's blood, and through blood it can be extended to those who share her lineage." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. Her sister, Petunia Dursley. Precisely. By living with his mother's sister, Harry carries within himself a protection that no Dark Lord can breach, no curse can penetrate. Dumbledore turned back to face them, his expression grave. "But there is a price for such protection, as there is for all magic of this magnitude." "What price?" Kingsley asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. The protection requires sacrifice. Not just Lily's sacrifice, which was given freely, but ongoing sacrifice from Harry himself. Dumbledore's voice was soft, almost hypnotic. The magic feeds on his suffering, grows stronger with his isolation, becomes more powerful as he learns to value any gesture of kindness. The more Harry suffers at Privet Drive, the more protected he becomes from the forces that would destroy him. The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur stared at Dumbledore, struggling to process what he'd just heard. The man who had taught them all about fighting for what was right, about protecting the innocent, about standing against those who would use others for their own ends, had just calmly explained why he was systematically torturing a child. "You're lying," McGonagall said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Dumbledore moved to his desk and pulled out a thick tome bound in black leather. "The principles of sacrificial blood magic are well documented, Minerva. Would you like to review the research I've conducted over the past months? The calculations that show how Harry's emotional state directly correlates with the strength of his protection?" Arthur stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Even if that's true, even if the magic works the way you say it does, you had no right to make that choice for Harry. No right to condemn a child to years of suffering for some theoretical protection." "Theoretical?" Dumbledore's eyebrows rose. "Arthur, do you truly believe that Voldemort is gone forever? That his followers have simply accepted defeat and returned to their quiet lives? The protection I have given Harry is the only thing standing between him and forces that would see him dead before his 5th birthday." "What forces?" Kingsley demanded. "Voldemort is dead. His inner circle is imprisoned or fled. The war is over." Dumbledore's smile was pitying. "Is it? Tell me, Kingsley, how many Death Eaters were actually captured after Voldemort's defeat? How many simply removed their masks and melted back into respectable society? How many are even now plotting their revenge against the boy who destroyed their master?" Arthur felt doubt creeping into his certainty, like cold water seeping through cracks in stone. He forced himself to think clearly, to remember what they had discovered about the 17 children under surveillance, about the systematic nature of Dumbledore's program. "No, even if you're right about Harry needing protection," he said, "what about the other children? Susan Bones, the Clearwater girl, the others you're monitoring? Are they all in mortal danger from Voldemort's supporters?" For the first time, Dumbledore's expression showed a flicker of something other than serene confidence. "The other children serve different purposes in different circumstances. Some require protection of their own. Others must be observed to ensure they develop in ways that serve the greater good." "The greater good." McGonagall's voice was flat with disgust. "How many times have I heard you use those words to justify the unjustifiable?" "As many times as necessary," Dumbledore replied calmly. "Minerva, you have seen what happens when dark wizards gain power. You have watched families torn apart, or children murdered, entire communities destroyed. If preventing such horrors requires difficult choices, if it requires sacrificing the happiness of a few to save the lives of many, then I will make those choices." Arthur stared at the man he had once revered, the wizard he had trusted with his life and the lives of his family, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This wasn't evil in the sense he had understood it during the war. It wasn't the malevolent cruelty of Voldemort or his followers. This was something worse in its own way, a kind of calculating benevolence that reduced human beings to game pieces in some vast strategy only Dumbledore could see. "You don't get to make that choice," Arthur said quietly. "No one gets to decide that some people should suffer so that others can be safe, or no one has the right to play God with children's lives." Dumbledore's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I don't play God, Arthur. I simply recognize that someone must make the hard choices, must bear the burden of seeing the larger picture when others cannot. If I do not guide events toward the outcomes that serve the greatest number, who will? Maybe, McGonagall said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. The events should guide themselves. Maybe children should be allowed to grow up loved and safe. And maybe we should deal with threats as they arise, instead of creating suffering to prevent suffering that might never come. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes moving from one face to another, measuring their resolve. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of finality that sent ice through Arthur's veins. I had hoped you would understand. I had hoped that your years of fighting beside me, seeing the cost of unpreparedness and moral squeamishness, would have taught you the value of pragmatic action. He returned to his chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 100+ years. But I see that you have chosen idealism over wisdom. We've chosen right over wrong, Kingsley said firmly. Have you? Dumbledore's smile was sad and somehow dangerous. Then I suppose you will do what you believe is right, regardless of the consequences. You will attempt to remove Harry from his current guardians, expose the protection protocols I have established, and trust that your noble intentions will somehow shield him from the very real dangers that surround him. Arthur felt a trap closing around them, though he couldn't yet see its shape. What are you saying? I am saying that if you proceed with this course of action, if you continue to interfere with the measures I have put in place for Harry's protection and the security of our world, you will force me to take steps I would prefer to avoid. The threat hung in the air between them like a curse waiting to be triggered. McGonagall's face had gone pale, and Arthur could see her hands trembling with suppressed emotion. "Are you threatening us?" she asked. "I am warning you," Dumbledore corrected gently. "You have stumbled upon information that could destabilize the very foundations of our society if misused. Or Harry Potter's protection depends on secrecy, on the careful maintenance of conditions that you clearly find objectionable. If you disrupt those conditions in pursuit of your ideological purity, you will not only doom Harry to a death I have spent months ensuring he can avoid, you will also force me to treat you as enemies of the greater good." Arthur felt the words hit him like physical blows. Enemies of the greater good. In Dumbledore's lexicon, there was no accusation more damning, no category more dangerous to occupy. "We won't be intimidated," he said, though his voice sounded less steady than he'd intended. "I sincerely hope not," Dumbledore replied, "because intimidation implies that I am bluffing, and I assure you I am not. Harry Potter will remain where I have placed him, under the protection I have arranged, for as long as I deem it necessary. The other children will continue to be monitored according to the protocols I have established, and anyone who attempts to interfere with these arrangements will discover that my commitment to the greater good extends to neutralizing threats to it." Dumbledore stood again, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. "I have given you more explanation than anyone else will receive, out of respect for our past association. Do not mistake that respect for weakness, or that explanation for negotiation. There is no negotiation. There is only the choice of whether you will trust my judgment or force me to treat you as obstacles to be removed." Arthur looked at McGonagall and Kingsley, seeing his own shock and horror reflected in their faces. They had come here hoping to reason with Dumbledore, or to appeal to his conscience, to make him see that what he was doing was wrong. Instead, they had discovered that Dumbledore knew exactly what he was doing and considered it not just justified, but essential. "We need time to think," McGonagall said finally. "Of course," Dumbledore agreed pleasantly, his threatening demeanor dissolving back into grandfatherly kindness, as if it had never existed. "Take all the time you need. But please remember that while you are thinking, Harry Potter remains protected by magic that has kept him alive for the past month. Magic that depends on conditions you find distressing but I find necessary." Arthur followed McGonagall and Kingsley toward the spiral staircase, his mind reeling from the confrontation. As they reached the door, Dumbledore's voice stopped them one final time. "Oh, and Arthur? Please give my regards to your family. Molly, isn't it? And 6 children? How precious they are. How important it is to keep them safe." The words were spoken gently, almost fondly, but Arthur heard the message beneath them as clearly as if Dumbledore had shouted it, a reminder that Arthur had much to lose, a suggestion that his family's safety might depend on his choices, a threat wrapped in kindness, delivered with a grandfather's smile. Arthur didn't trust himself to respond. He simply followed his companions down the spiral staircase and out of the office, carrying with him the terrible knowledge that the man he had trusted most in the world was not just their enemy, but an enemy who would use any weapon, including Arthur's love for his children, to achieve his ends. The war, Arthur realized, was far from over, or it had simply changed battlefields, and the enemy now wore the face of their former greatest ally. Chapter 8. The Choice. The kitchen of the Burrow had never felt smaller to Arthur than it did on this cold December evening, with 5 adults crowded around the scrubbed wooden table that usually accommodated his large family's meals. Molly had sent the children to bed early after sensing the tension that hung in the air like smoke, and now the adults sat in the flickering candlelight, each lost in their own thoughts about what Dumbledore had revealed and threatened that afternoon. Arthur stared into his untouched cup of tea, replaying the confrontation in his mind, the casual way Dumbledore had mentioned his family, the gentle smile that had accompanied what amounted to a death threat, of the terrible logic of blood magic that turned Harry Potter's suffering into protection, his isolation into power. "He's not bluffing," Kingsley said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "About the threats, I mean. I've seen what happens to people who cross Dumbledore when he believes the greater good is at stake." Remus Lupin, who had arrived an hour ago, looking haggard and worn, looked up from his own untouched tea. "What do you mean?" Kingsley's expression was grim. There was an aura during the war. Marcus Flint, different from the Slytherin boy. This was his uncle. Marcus started asking questions about some of Dumbledore's more questionable strategies, wondering if we were being too cavalier with civilian lives. Within a month, he was transferred to a desk job processing paperwork. Within 6 months, he'd been dismissed from the ministry entirely on charges of incompetence and disloyalty. Arthur felt his stomach clench. "You think Dumbledore was behind it?" "I think Dumbledore has been playing a longer game than any of us realized, and anyone who threatens that game gets removed from the board." Kingsley leaned back in his chair, looking older than his years. "The question is whether we're willing to accept that risk." McGonagall, who had been silent since their return from Hogwarts, finally spoke. "The question isn't whether we're willing to accept the risk to ourselves. The question is whether we can live with ourselves if we do nothing." "Easy for you to say," Kingsley replied, though without heat. "You're a teacher. If Dumbledore destroys your career, you can find work at another magical school, or tutor private students, or write textbooks. I'm an aura. If the ministry marks me as untrustworthy, I'll never work in law enforcement again. And what am I qualified for besides catching dark wizards?" Arthur understood the fear in his friend's voice, but he also understood something else. "Kingsley, what kind of law are we enforcing if we ignore systematic child abuse, because the person responsible has enough power to destroy us for speaking out? The kind of law that keeps the wizarding world stable and safe," Kingsley said, but his voice lacked conviction. Molly, who had been listening with the patient attention of someone who had spent years mediating disputes between children, leaned forward. "Let me ask you something, Kingsley. You have a job, a reputation, a future. Those are all important things. But if you wake up 20 years from now and Harry Potter has become exactly what Dumbledore is trying to shape him into, isolated, dependent, broken, will any of those things matter to you?" Kingsley was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "No. they won't. Arthur felt something shift in the room, a subtle change in the quality of attention. They were no longer debating whether to act. They were moving toward the question of how to act. "We need to be realistic about what we're facing," McGonagall said, her voice taking on the brisk, practical tone Arthur remembered from his school days. "Dumbledore has legal authority for everything he's doing. He has the support of the Ministry, the Wizengamot, and most of the wizarding world. He has resources we can't match and influence we can't counter. But he also has weaknesses," Arthur said, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "He's been so focused on magical solutions, on blood wards and protection spells and monitoring charms, that he's ignored the Muggle world entirely." Remus looked up with interest. "What do you mean?" Arthur stood and began pacing, his mind working through possibilities he'd never considered before. "Dumbledore placed Harry with his aunt and uncle because they're his only blood relatives, but he's treating this as a purely magical problem, solved through magical means. He's not thinking about Muggle laws, Muggle authorities, Muggle ways of protecting children." "Arthur," McGonagall said slowly, "are you suggesting we involve Muggle authorities in a magical matter?" "I'm suggesting that Harry Potter is a British citizen, and British citizens have rights under Muggle law regardless of their magical status." Arthur's excitement was building as the plan took shape. "If we can document the Dursleys' mistreatment of Harry using Muggle methods, photographs, medical records, witness statements, we can file a complaint with Muggle social services." Kingsley frowned. "But the statute of secrecy doesn't prevent us from reporting child abuse to the proper authorities," Arthur finished. "We wouldn't have to mention magic at all. Harry is a toddler living with relatives who neglect and emotionally abuse him. That's a crime under Muggle law, and Muggle authorities have the power to remove him from that environment." Molly's eyes lit up with understanding. "And once Harry is in Muggle protective custody, Dumbledore loses his legal standing to control the placement. He'd have to work within the Muggle system to regain custody, which would expose his methods to scrutiny he can't control. More than that," Arthur continued, his enthusiasm growing, "if Harry is placed with loving Muggle foster parents, Dumbledore's blood ward argument falls apart. He can't claim the protection requires Harry to live with the Dursleys if Harry is safe and happy elsewhere." McGonagall stood and joined Arthur in his pacing. "It's brilliant in its simplicity. Dumbledore has been thinking like a wizard, assuming that magical problems require magical solutions. But Harry is both a wizard and a Muggle citizen, and Muggle law doesn't recognize magical authority over child welfare." "There are risks," Remus said quietly, "if we're wrong about how Muggle authorities would handle this, if they're not able to protect Harry from magical threats." "What magical threats?" Arthur demanded. "Dumbledore claimed that Death Eaters were still hunting Harry, but he provided no evidence. And even if some of Voldemort's followers want revenge, they're not going to attack a child in Muggle protective custody. They're cowards who prey on isolated victims, not the kind of killers who would assault a government facility." Kingsley nodded slowly. "Actually, it makes sense from a security standpoint. Death Eaters operate by infiltrating magical institutions and exploiting personal connections. They have no experience with Muggle bureaucracies, no contacts in social services, no way to track a child who's been placed through official Muggle channels." "And we wouldn't be acting against Dumbledore directly," McGonagall added. "We'd be acting within the law, using legitimate channels to protect a child who's being harmed. He couldn't accuse us of treachery or disloyalty to the wizarding world." Arthur felt a weight lifting from his shoulders for the first time since this whole ordeal began. "We'd need evidence, real evidence, the kind that would hold up in Muggle courts." "I can help with that," Molly said. "I know how to take proper photographs, how to document injuries and neglect, and I know what social workers look for when they're evaluating a child's living situation." Arthur looked at his wife with surprise. "How do you know about social workers?" Molly's expression grew sad. "During the war, we had to know. There were Muggle-born children who lost their parents. Children who needed to be placed in safe homes while their families were in hiding. I worked with several Muggle agencies to help arrange emergency placements. She straightened in her chair. I know how the system works, and I know how to work within it. What about the risk to your own career, Arthur? Remus asked. If Dumbledore discovers you were involved, then I'll deal with the consequences, Arthur said firmly. But Remus, I work in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office. My job is to understand how the Muggle world works, to serve as a bridge between magical and non-magical authorities when necessary. But I can frame this as part of my official duties, a Ministry employee investigating potential violations of the Statute of Secrecy. McGonagall stopped pacing and faced them all. If we do this, if we commit to this course of action, there's no going back. Once we involve Muggle authorities, once we set this process in motion, we'll have declared war on Dumbledore, whether we intended to or not. Haven't we already? Kingsley asked. After what he said today, after the threats he made, do any of us believe we can simply return to our normal lives and pretend this conversation never happened? Arthur thought of Harry Potter standing at that window, small and alone, and learning all the wrong lessons about what he deserved from the world. He thought of his own children, safe in their beds upstairs, and what kind of world he wanted them to inherit. I'm willing to accept the risk, he said quietly. Harry Potter deserves better than what Dumbledore has planned for him. He deserves a childhood, a chance to grow up loved and safe. If I have to choose between my career and a child's welfare, that's not really a choice at all. One by one, the others nodded their agreement. McGonagall, with fierce determination. Kingsley, with resigned courage. Remus, with quiet hope. Molly, with maternal fire. Then we're committed, McGonagall said. Arthur, you and Molly will gather evidence of Harry's mistreatment using Muggle methods. Kingsley, you'll research legal precedents for removing magical children from harmful situations. Remus, you'll help coordinate communications and serve as a safe contact point for anyone who needs to reach us. Arthur felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness he hadn't experienced since discovering that surveillance form weeks ago. What about you, Minerva? McGonagall's smile was sharp as a blade. I'm going to resign from Hogwarts. The statement hit them like a physical blow. Arthur stared at her in shock. Minerva, you can't. Hogwarts is your life, your calling. Hogwarts is Dumbledore's school, and I will not continue to work for a man who tortures children for the greater good. Her voice was steady and implacable. My resignation will send a message to the wizarding world that not everyone who knows Dumbledore personally supports his methods. It will give credibility to any accusations we might need to make. It will also destroy your career, Remus pointed out. Perhaps there are more people than we realize who are uncomfortable with Dumbledore's methods but haven't had the courage to speak out. My resignation might give them permission to question things they've been accepting on faith. McGonagall moved to the window and stared out at the star-filled sky. Besides, I can't protect children from dark wizards while enabling a man who creates dark wizards through systematic abuse. Arthur joined her at the window, looking out at the peaceful landscape surrounding his home. Somewhere out there, Harry Potter was sleeping in a house where he wasn't wanted, dreaming whatever dreams unloved children had. But not for much longer. When do we start? He asked. Tomorrow, McGonagall said. I'll submit my resignation in the morning. Arthur, you and Molly begin documenting the situation at Privet Drive. Kingsley, start researching legal frameworks. Remus, prepare safe houses where we can meet without being observed. And if Dumbledore tries to stop us? Molly asked. Arthur thought of the threat in Dumbledore's voice, the casual mention of his family's safety. Then we remind him that we're not the only ones with something to lose. If he tries to hurt us or our families, we'll make sure the entire wizarding world knows exactly what kind of man they've been trusting with their children's lives. Outside, winter wind rattled the windows of the burrow. But inside, the 5 adults sat in the warm glow of candlelight and planned the salvation of a child they barely knew from the man who had taught them all what it meant to fight for justice. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Dumbledore had trained them too well, had instilled in them too deep a commitment to protecting the innocent. Now they would use everything he had taught them against his own carefully constructed plans. And Arthur suspected that somewhere in his heart, beneath all the calculation and manipulation, Albus Dumbledore would be proud of them for it, right up until the moment they succeeded in tearing down everything he had built. Chapter 9. The Rescue. The morning of December 15th dawned cold and grey over little whinging Surrey, with the kind of biting wind that cut through even the heaviest winter cloaks. Arthur sat in his ministry-issued Ford Anglia, 2 streets away from Privet Drive, checking his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes while reviewing the carefully orchestrated plan that would either save Harry Potter or destroy them all. At precisely 9:30 a.m., Mrs. Margaret Hopwood from Surrey Social Services would arrive at No. 4 Privet Drive for what the Dursleys believed to be a routine follow-up visit regarding their sickly nephew's adjustment to their household. What the Dursleys didn't know was that Mrs. Hopwood had already reviewed a comprehensive file of evidence documenting Harry Potter's neglect and emotional abuse. What she also didn't know was that Arthur Weasley, senior investigator for the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, was parked nearby, with legal authority, to intervene in any situation that might threaten the statute of secrecy, including the potential exposure of a magical child to Muggle authorities who weren't prepared to handle his special circumstances. Arthur's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he spotted Mrs. Hopwood's sensible grey sedan turning onto Privet Drive. The social worker was exactly as Molly had described from their carefully rehearsed meeting, middle-aged, competent, and possessed of the particular brand of fierce protectiveness that drove people to careers in child welfare. Phase 1 of the operation was beginning. Arthur started his engine and drove slowly toward No. 4, timing his arrival to coincide with Mrs. Hopwood's emergence from the house. He didn't have to wait long. 15 minutes after she'd entered, the social worker came striding out of the Dursley house with her mouth set in a grim line and a toddler bundled in her arms. Harry Potter looked smaller than Arthur had expected, smaller and more fragile than any child should look at 16 months old. His dark hair stuck up at impossible angles, and even from a distance Arthur could see that his clothes hung loose on his thin frame. But it was Harry's eyes that made Arthur's chest tight with rage, the careful, watchful expression of a child who had already learned that the world was not a safe place. Arthur parked behind Mrs. Hopwood's car and approached her with his ministry identification prominently displayed. Mrs. Hopwood, Arthur Weasley, Ministry of Magic, Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. I understand you have a situation here that may require specialized intervention. Mrs. Hopwood looked at his credentials with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to dealing with various government agencies. Mr. Weasley, yes, I believe we may have a case that falls under your purview. The child appears to be unusual. In what way? Arthur asked, though he already knew what she would say. The evidence Molly had helped document had been carefully selected to suggest magical incidents that the Dursleys couldn't explain or control. According to the Guardians, young Harry here has been causing what they call freakish accidents since arriving in their care. Toys floating, glass breaking without cause, unusual incidents with household animals. Mrs. Hopwood's voice was carefully neutral, but Arthur could see the concern in her eyes. More importantly, the child shows clear signs of emotional neglect and possible psychological abuse. Arthur looked down at Harry, who was staring up at him with those impossibly green eyes. Lily's eyes, he realized with a pang of recognition. Has he been examined by a medical professional? I've arranged for an immediate assessment. Mrs. Hopwood adjusted her grip on Harry, who had begun to fuss softly. "But Mr. Weasley, if this child is what I think he might be, are there special protocols for his care?" This was the moment Arthur had been preparing for, the delicate balance between protecting magical secrecy and protecting Harry. "There are specialized care facilities for children with unusual circumstances. With your permission, I'd like to escort you and the child to a location where he can receive appropriate assessment and care." Mrs. Hopwood studied Arthur's face for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, but I want a full report on his condition and any special provisions for his welfare." "Of course," Arthur agreed. "You'll have complete documentation." 20 minutes later, Arthur was driving toward the safe house Remus had prepared in a quiet village outside London, with Harry Potter secured in a car seat that Molly had charmed to be perfectly safe and comfortable. Mrs. Hopwood followed in her own car, unaware that she was part of a rescue operation that had been weeks in the planning. The safe house was a modest cottage, surrounded by protective wards that would prevent anyone from finding it without explicit invitation. Yet Arthur had barely stopped the car before Molly came rushing out, followed by McGonagall and Kingsley. "How is he?" Molly asked immediately, reaching for Harry as Arthur lifted him from the car seat. Arthur felt his throat tighten as he passed Harry to his wife. The child went willingly enough, but there was a wariness in his posture that spoke of too much experience with disappointment. "He's underweight, probably hasn't been eating properly." Mrs. Hopwood documented bruising on his arms consistent with being grabbed too roughly, and there are signs of prolonged emotional distress. McGonagall approached with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades evaluating children's well-being. "May I?" she asked Molly, who nodded and gently transferred Harry to McGonagall's arms. Harry regarded McGonagall with solemn curiosity, his green eyes taking in her stern features and neat robes. When she began a gentle magical diagnostic, murmuring softly in Latin while her wand traced complex patterns in the air, Harry didn't flinch or cry. Instead, he watched with the fascination of a child who recognized magic when he saw it. "Malnutrition," McGonagall said after several minutes, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Chronic sleep deprivation. Elevated stress indicators consistent with ongoing emotional trauma." She looked up at Arthur with eyes that blazed with fury. "And there's something else. His magical core is suppressed, deliberately constrained, as if someone has been trying to prevent accidental magic." Arthur felt his own anger surge. "How?" "Proximity to people who radiate active hostility toward magic, a constant negative reinforcement when magical incidents occur. It's a form of magical abuse I've only read about in historical texts." McGonagall's voice grew deadly quiet. "They've been systematically crushing his natural magical development." Mrs. Hopwood, who had been listening to this exchange with professional attention, stepped forward. "I don't pretend to understand all of what you're describing, but I can see that this child has been deliberately harmed by the people who were supposed to care for him. What are your recommendations for his placement?" This was phase 2 of the plan, and Arthur felt his pulse quicken as they moved toward the most critical moment. "Mrs. Hopwood, I need to inform you that Harry Potter is a very special case. His parents were killed in what you would understand as a terrorist attack, and there are ongoing security concerns about his safety." "What kind of security concerns?" Kingsley stepped forward, his aura identification clearly visible. "The kind that require him to be placed with a family that has both the resources to protect him and the understanding to help him recover from what he's experienced. I've prepared a placement recommendation that I believe serves both his immediate needs and long-term security." Kingsley handed Mrs. Hopwood an official-looking document that Arthur knew contained carefully crafted truth: the Weasley family's status as ministry employees with security clearance, their experience with children and magical households, their willingness to provide Harry with the specialized care he needed while maintaining appropriate discretion about his circumstances. What the document didn't mention was that this placement would be completely outside Dumbledore's control or influence. Mrs. Hopwood read through the placement recommendation, with the careful attention of someone who had seen too many children failed by inadequate care. This family, the Weasleys, they understand the child's special circumstances. "We have 6 children of our own," Molly said quietly, still holding Harry, who had relaxed enough to let his head rest against her shoulder. "We understand what children need to heal from trauma, and we understand how to help them develop their unusual abilities safely." Arthur watched Mrs. Hopwood evaluate his wife, taking in her calm competence, the obvious love in her voice, the way Harry had instinctively trusted her. Finally, she nodded. "I'll need regular reports on his progress, and periodic inspections to ensure his well-being, but given the specialized nature of his case and the clear inadequacy of his previous placement, I'm prepared to authorize emergency temporary custody with your family." Arthur felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for weeks. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. Harry Potter was safe. Phase 3 of the operation, ensuring Dumbledore couldn't easily reverse their actions, began immediately. "Mrs. Hopwood," Arthur said, "for security reasons, it's essential that information about Harry's placement be restricted to essential personnel only. I'll need you to flag his file for security review and limit access to senior management." "Of course," Mrs. Hopwood agreed. "Given what I observed at his previous placement, I'm also opening an investigation into the authorization process that placed him there initially. Someone will need to answer for how a child ended up in such unsuitable care." Arthur exchanged glances with Kingsley and McGonagall. They hadn't expected Mrs. Hopwood to take the initiative in investigating the original placement, but it would provide additional protection against Dumbledore's influence. After Mrs. Hopwood left, promising to return in a week for her first follow-up visit, the adults gathered in the cottage's small sitting room, while Harry explored his new surroundings with the careful curiosity of a child who wasn't sure if good things were permanent. "He's going to need time," McGonagall observed, watching Harry examine a wooden toy dragon with fascination. "The magical suppression will fade as he feels safer, but the emotional damage will take much longer to heal." "He'll have all the time he needs," Molly said firmly, settling onto the floor beside Harry and showing him how to make the toy dragon spread its wings. "And he'll have people who love him while he heals." Arthur watched his wife interact with Harry, patient, gentle, radiating the kind of unconditional acceptance that Harry had never experienced, and felt a fierce protectiveness settle in his chest. This child was part of their family now, in all the ways that mattered. "What about Dumbledore?" Remus asked quietly. "He'll know by now that Harry is missing from Privet Drive." Kingsley smiled grimly. "Let him know. Harry Potter is now under the protection of Muggle authorities and placed according to their assessment and protocols. If Dumbledore wants to challenge the placement, or he'll have to work within the Muggle legal system, where his reputation and influence carry no weight." "More than that," Arthur added. "Any attempt to circumvent Muggle authorities or remove Harry from authorized care would be a clear violation of the Statute of Secrecy. The Ministry would have to investigate, and we'd make sure they understood exactly why Harry was removed from his original placement." McGonagall stood and moved to the window, looking out at the peaceful countryside that surrounded their safe house. "He'll try to get Harry back. We all know that. But for the first time since this began, we're not playing by his rules." Arthur joined her at the window, watching the winter landscape, while behind them, Molly helped Harry stack wooden blocks into a tower that glowed with soft, happy magic, the first sign that the child's natural abilities were beginning to recover. "Let him try," Arthur said quietly. "Harry Potter finally has people fighting for him instead of using him. And we're not going to let anyone, not Dumbledore, not the Ministry, not anyone, hurt him again." Outside, snow began to fall over the countryside, but inside the cottage, a little boy who had never known what it meant to be safe was learning to laugh at the simple pleasure of blocks that sparkled when he touched them. For the first time in his short life, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, and 4 adults who had risked everything to save him stood watch, ready to face whatever consequences their actions might bring. Chapter 10. The Ministry Storm. The Wizengamot chamber had never felt more imposing to Arthur than it did on the cold January morning when he stood before the assembled members of Wizarding Britain's highest court, every eye fixed on him, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. The ancient stone chamber echoed with whispered conversations as witches and wizards in plum-coloured robes took their seats, their chains of office catching the light from the floating candles overhead. Arthur straightened his shoulders and tried to project more confidence than he felt. 3 weeks had passed since Harry Potter's rescue from Privet Drive, 3 weeks during which the wizarding world had slowly awakened to the reality that their greatest hero might have feet of clay. The Daily Prophet had initially dismissed the story as malicious gossip, but as more evidence emerged, even the most Dumbledore-sympathetic journalists had been forced to acknowledge that something deeply troubling had occurred. Arthur Septimus Weasley, Chief Warlock Eugenia Jenkins called from the elevated central podium, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. You stand before this assembly to give testimony regarding allegations of unauthorized surveillance and child endangerment involving one Harry James Potter. Do you swear to give truthful testimony under the auspices of magical oath? I do so swear, Arthur replied, feeling the familiar tingle of binding magic settle around his words. Jenkins nodded curtly. Or please state your position and relationship to the matters under investigation. Arthur cleared his throat and began the testimony he'd practiced dozens of times. I am senior investigator for the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office, a position I've held for 7 years. In early November of 1981, I discovered a surveillance authorization for Harry Potter that had been misfiled in my department's paperwork. The authorization bore the signature of Albus Dumbledore and was dated November 1st, 1981, the day after Mr. Potter's parents were killed. A murmur ran through the assembled Wizengamot members. Arthur waited for quiet before continuing. The scope of surveillance authorized was unprecedented in my experience. It included continuous monitoring of the child's magical development, psychological evaluation, assessment of social interactions, and documentation of what the form termed environmental stressors. And this seemed unusual to you? Asked Tiberius Ogden from his seat in the front row. Extraordinary, Arthur replied firmly. Protective surveillance of endangered children typically focuses on external threats. This authorization focused on the child himself and his living environment, as if the primary concern was documenting his experiences rather than protecting him from harm. Arthur went on to describe his investigation, the evidence he'd gathered with McGonagall and Kingsley, and the systematic nature of what they'd discovered. He spoke carefully but comprehensively about the 17 children under surveillance, the intervention protocols that authorized their removal from loving homes, and the blocked adoption applications that had prevented Harry from being placed with suitable families. Mr. Weasley, interrupted Augustus Rookwood, a wizard Arthur recognized as a ministry department head. Are you testifying that Albus Dumbledore, Order of Merlin First Class, and Chief Warlock of this very body, deliberately placed a child in an abusive situation? Arthur met Rookwood's skeptical gaze steadily. I am testifying that the evidence indicates Harry Potter was placed with guardians whose hostility toward magic and systematic mistreatment of the child were known to those who authorized the placement. Whether this was deliberate or negligent is for this body to determine. What Arthur didn't say, what the magical oath prevented him from saying, was that he suspected Rookwood himself might have been aware of Dumbledore's program. Several of the surveillance authorizations had crossed Rookwood's desk for interdepartmental coordination. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, with various Wizengamot members probing different aspects of Arthur's testimony. Some seemed genuinely shocked by what they were hearing. Others appeared to be looking for ways to discredit or minimize the evidence. But Arthur had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and his answers were thorough, factual, and impossible to dismiss. The most dramatic moment came when Amelia Bones rose from her seat to address the chamber. Arthur had wondered if she would attend, given that her niece was among the children under surveillance, but her presence lent enormous credibility to the proceedings. "Mr. Weasley," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her position as head of magical law enforcement. "You mentioned that intervention protocols existed for the children under surveillance. Can you describe what you discovered about these protocols?" Arthur felt the chamber's attention sharpen. The protocols authorized the removal of children from their current guardians if their psychological development proceeded outside acceptable parameters. In the case of your niece, Miss Susan Bones, the file indicated that she could be removed from your care if she showed signs of what was termed excessive independence or resistance to authority. The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur could see the shock on Amelia Bones's face, the way her hands gripped the arms of her chair as she processed what he'd just revealed. "You're saying," she said slowly, "that my 3-year-old niece was being monitored for signs of independence and could be taken from me if she showed too much of it?" "That is what the documentation indicated, yes." Amelia Bones sat back down heavily, her face pale, with what Arthur recognized as the particular fury of someone discovering that their child had been threatened. He'd felt that same rage when Dumbledore had mentioned his family during their confrontation. The testimony phase concluded with Kingsley Shacklebolt's presentation of the Aura investigation findings and McGonagall's expert evaluation of Harry Potter's condition when he was removed from the Dursleys. McGonagall's clinical description of the child's malnutrition, trauma symptoms, and suppressed magical development left several Wizengamot members visibly shaken. The most troubling finding, McGonagall concluded, was evidence of deliberate magical suppression. The child's natural magical abilities had been systematically constrained through exposure to an environment of active hostility toward magic. This is a form of abuse that can cause permanent damage to a young wizard's development. Chief Warlock Jenkins called for a brief recess, during which Arthur was approached by several Wizengamot members who wanted to hear more details about specific aspects of his investigation. The mood in the chamber had shifted noticeably from skepticism to grim concern. When proceedings resumed, Jenkins addressed the assembly with unusual gravity. "Members of the Wizengamot, we have heard testimony today that, if true, represents a profound violation of our most sacred duty to protect magical children. Before we move to formal deliberations, I believe we must address the fact that the individual primarily accused of these violations currently holds a seat on this very body." All eyes turned to the ornate chair that normally held Albus Dumbledore during Wizengamot sessions. The chair had been empty throughout the morning's proceedings. Albus Dumbledore was formally invited to attend today's session to respond to these allegations, Jenkins continued. His absence speaks for itself. However, we have received a letter from Professor Dumbledore that I will now read into the record. Jenkins unfolded a piece of parchment and began to read in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber. "To the esteemed members of the Wizengamot, I find myself unable to attend today's proceedings due to pressing matters concerning the ongoing security of our world. The decisions I have made regarding the placement and protection of war orphans were guided by intelligence unavailable to others and necessities that transcend ordinary considerations of comfort or conventional wisdom. History will vindicate the choices made in service of the greater good, and even when those choices are misunderstood, by well-meaning individuals who lack access to the full scope of the threats we face. I trust that this distinguished body will consider the source and motivation of these accusations with appropriate skepticism." Jenkins set down the letter and looked out over the assembled members. "Let the record show that Professor Dumbledore has chosen not to appear before this body to answer these charges directly." The implications of Dumbledore's absence rippled through the chamber like a stone dropped in still water. Arthur could see members whispering to each other, could feel the shift in momentum as Dumbledore's failure to defend himself was interpreted as an admission of guilt. The formal vote, when it came after 3 hours of deliberation, was overwhelming. The Wizengamot voted 37-8 to censure Dumbledore for unauthorized surveillance of magical children and abuse of his authority as Chief Warlock. They voted 41-4 to strip him of his position on the Wizengamot, pending a full investigation. Most significantly, they voted unanimously to establish a new oversight committee for child welfare cases, with Amelia Bones as its chair. Arthur left the ministry that evening, feeling as though he'd witnessed a seismic shift in wizarding society. The Daily Prophet's evening edition carried headlines that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Dumbledore stripped of Wizengamot position and child surveillance, scandal rocks ministry. But as important as the political victories were, Arthur found his thoughts turning to the more personal victory waiting for him at home. Harry Potter was learning what it meant to be loved. The cottage that had served as their safe house had been transformed into a genuine home over the past 3 weeks. Harry, who had been silent and withdrawn during his first days with the Weasleys, was beginning to show signs of the curiosity and playfulness that should have characterized a child his age. Arthur arrived home to find Harry in the kitchen with Molly, standing on a chair beside the stove, and helping her prepare dinner by stirring a pot with intense concentration. His dark hair was still impossible to tame, but his cheeks had filled out, and his clothes no longer hung loose on his small frame. "Papa!" Harry exclaimed when he saw Arthur, using the word that had emerged naturally as he'd learned that this place was safe, that these people would stay, that he was wanted here. Arthur's throat tightened, as it did every time Harry used that word. "Hello, little one. How was your day?" "Harry helped make bread," Molly reported, her voice warm with pride. "And he made the flour fly around the kitchen like snow. Quite impressive magic for someone his age." Arthur smiled, remembering McGonagall's assessment that Harry's magical abilities would recover quickly in a supportive environment. The child who had been systematically taught to suppress his magic was now encouraged to explore it safely, with predictable results. "I made sparkles," Harry announced, holding up his hands and concentrating until tiny points of light danced around his fingers. It was simple magic, of the kind any magical child might display. But for Harry it represented something profound, the freedom to be himself. After dinner, as Arthur tucked Harry into the small bed they'd set up in what used to be a spare room, the child looked up at him with those impossibly green eyes. "Papa," Harry said quietly, "will the bad man come back?" Arthur's chest tightened. Harry had never directly asked about his time with the Dursleys, but his nightmares and occasional moments of fearful withdrawal made it clear that he remembered more than a child his age should have to remember. "No," Arthur said firmly, smoothing Harry's wild hair. "The bad people can't hurt you anymore. Mama and I won't let them." Harry nodded solemnly and closed his eyes, but his small hand remained clasped around Arthur's finger until sleep claimed him. But later that evening, as Arthur sat in the kitchen with Molly and reviewed the day's events, his wife looked up from her knitting with the expression she wore when she was processing something significant. "The papers are calling you a hero," she said quietly, "saying you saved Harry Potter from Dumbledore's manipulation." Arthur considered this. "I don't feel like a hero. I feel like someone who did what needed doing when everyone else was too afraid to act." "That's exactly what heroes do," Molly replied. "They act when action is needed, regardless of the personal cost." Arthur looked toward the stairs, thinking of the little boy sleeping peacefully in his bed, surrounded by toys and books and all the trappings of a childhood that should never have been denied to him. "The personal cost was worth it," he said quietly. "But whatever happens next, Harry is safe. He's loved. He has a chance to grow up the way James and Lily would have wanted." Outside, January snow fell over their hidden cottage, but inside, the Weasley family slept peacefully, one member larger than they'd been a month ago. Harry Potter, no longer the boy who lived, but simply Harry, beloved son and brother, dreamed whatever dreams happy children have, protected by people who had proven that sometimes love really could conquer all. And in the morning, the wizarding world would continue to grapple with the revelation that their greatest hero had been willing to sacrifice a child's happiness for his vision of the greater good, while that same child learned to laugh at the simple pleasure of toast cut into star shapes and marmalade that glowed with harmless, happy magic. Chapter 11. The Reckoning. The morning of February 14th brought more than Valentine's Day to the wizarding world. It brought the formal announcement that would mark the end of an era. Arthur sat in his newly appointed office in the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, reading the Daily Prophet headline that he had been expecting, but somehow still found shocking. Dumbledore resigns all positions. Former Chief Warlock steps down from Hogwarts, ICW and Wizengamot. The article detailed what Arthur already knew from ministry channels. Faced with mounting pressure from multiple investigations and a complete loss of confidence from the Wizengamot, Albus Dumbledore had chosen to resign from his positions as headmaster of Hogwarts, supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, and chief warlock of the Wizengamot, rather than face formal removal proceedings. Arthur set down the paper and looked around his new office, larger than his old space in the misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, with windows that actually let in natural light, and enough room for the extensive files he now managed as Senior Director of Child Welfare Oversight. His promotion had come through 3 weeks ago, part of Minister Millicent Bagnold's broader reorganization of ministry departments in the wake of what the papers were calling the child surveillance scandal. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Arthur called, expecting his assistant with the morning's case files. Instead, Kingsley Shacklebolt stepped into the office, was looking considerably more relaxed than he had during the tense weeks of investigation and testimony. Kingsley's own career had survived the upheaval. His role in exposing the surveillance program had actually enhanced his reputation within the Aura department. "Arthur," Kingsley said, settling into one of the chairs facing Arthur's desk. "Have you seen the final count?" Arthur nodded grimly. They'd spent weeks investigating every child who had been under Dumbledore's surveillance program, and the scope had proven even worse than they'd initially suspected. 23 children total. 8 of them had already been removed from loving homes under various pretexts. The 3 more were scheduled for intervention within the month. And now, all returned to appropriate guardians or placed with vetted families through proper channels, Arthur replied. The Clearwater girl is back with her grandmother. The Creevy boy is living with his aunt and uncle who adore him. Susan Bones never left Amelia's care, but the surveillance has been permanently ended. Kingsley leaned back in his chair. It's hard to believe it's over. Is it? Arthur asked. Dumbledore may have resigned, but he's still out there somewhere, and there are people who still believe he was right to do what he did. It was true. While the majority of Wizarding Society had been shocked by the revelations about the surveillance program, a vocal minority continued to defend Dumbledore's actions as necessary for the greater good. Or the Daily Prophet received letters daily from readers who argued that protecting children from future dark wizards justified any temporary harm inflicted in the present. Speaking of Dumbledore, Kingsley said, have you heard the rumors about where he's gone? Arthur shook his head. After his resignation, Dumbledore had simply vanished from public life. Some speculated that he'd left Britain entirely. Others believed he was in hiding somewhere, plotting his return to power. There's talk that he's been seen in Albania, of all places, Kingsley continued, searching for something. Some of the international auras think he's looking for artifacts that might restore his reputation or give him leverage to return. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of artifacts? Nobody knows for certain. But Arthur, Kingsley's voice grew serious. Whatever he's doing, wherever he is, I don't think we've seen the last of Albus Dumbledore. Men like that don't simply fade away when their plans are thwarted. Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. This time, it was Arthur's assistant, a competent young witch named Sarah Chen, who had transferred from the Department of International Magical Cooperation. "Mr. Weasley," she said, "Professor McGonagall is here to see you. She says it's about the Hogwarts transition." Arthur smiled. "Send her in, please." Minerva McGonagall entered with the brisk efficiency that had made her such an effective deputy headmistress, though Arthur noticed she looked less careworn than she had during the dark weeks of their investigation. Her appointment as interim headmistress of Hogwarts had been unanimous among the Board of Governors, and by all accounts she was settling into the role with her characteristic competence. "Arthur Kingsley," she greeted them, taking the remaining chair. "I wanted to update you on the situation at Hogwarts and discuss some ongoing concerns." "How are the students adjusting?" Arthur asked. The transition period had been difficult, with many families uncertain about sending their children to a school that had been under Dumbledore's direct control for so many years. "Better than expected, actually," McGonagall replied. The older students were naturally more aware of the circumstances surrounding Dumbledore's departure, but the younger ones have adapted quickly to the changes we've implemented. We've established new protocols for student welfare, including regular check-ins with families and mandatory reporting procedures for any concerns about a child's well-being. Arthur nodded approvingly. "What about the staff?" "Mixed reactions. Some faculty members are genuinely shocked by what was revealed about Dumbledore's methods. Others are struggling to reconcile their loyalty to him with the evidence of what he did to those children." McGonagall's expression grew troubled. "And then there are those who still believe he was justified." "Anyone in particular I should be concerned about?" Kingsley asked in his professional aura voice. McGonagall hesitated. "Severus Snape has been difficult. He's made several pointed comments about people who betray their betters and seems to view Dumbledore's resignation as a temporary setback rather than a consequence of wrongdoing." Arthur and Kingsley exchanged glances. Snape's loyalty to Dumbledore was well known, but his attitude could pose problems if he decided to take action to restore his former mentor. "I'll make sure the Aura Department keeps an eye on him," Kingsley said quietly. McGonagall nodded gratefully. "There's something else. I've been reviewing Dumbledore's private files, the ones he left behind in the headmaster's office. I found documentation of other programs, other experiments he was conducting." Arthur felt his stomach clench. "What kind of experiments?" "Research into magical cause and how trauma affects magical development. Detailed studies of how isolation and emotional deprivation can make young wizards more susceptible to external influence." McGonagall's voice was carefully controlled. "Arthur, I think the surveillance program was just the beginning. I think he was planning something much larger. The implications hung in the air like a curse." Arthur thought of Harry, safe and happy at home with Molly, and felt a surge of protective rage at the thought of what might have been planned for him. "We'll need to review everything," Arthur said finally. "Every file, every research note, every plan he might have been developing. If there are other children at risk, other programs we haven't discovered yet." "I'll coordinate with the Aura investigation team," Kingsley added. And I'll make sure the international community is aware that Dumbledore's activities may have extended beyond Britain." They spent another hour discussing the practical details of the ongoing investigations and the new child protection protocols Arthur was implementing across the magical community. When McGonagall and Kingsley finally left, Arthur felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. But it was a weight he was willing to bear, because that evening he would go home to a house filled with laughter and love, where Harry Potter was learning what it meant to be part of a real family. The cottage they'd been using as a safe house had been replaced the previous month by a larger home near Ottery St. Catchpole, close enough to the Burrow that the older Weasley children could visit easily, but spacious enough to accommodate their expanded family. Arthur apparated to the front garden and paused for a moment to listen to the sounds coming from inside. Molly's voice raised in mock exasperation, children's laughter, and the general chaos that meant everyone he loved was safe and happy. He found Harry in the sitting room, surrounded by wooden blocks that he was arranging into elaborate towers with the help of his accidental magic. At 18 months old, Harry was walking confidently, chattering in the mixture of real words and nonsense syllables typical of his age, and showing the kind of magical ability that suggested he would be a powerful wizard someday, when he chose to be, in his own time, without pressure or manipulation. "Papa home!" Harry announced when he spotted Arthur, abandoning his blocks to run across the room on slightly unsteady legs. Arthur scooped him up, marveling as he always did at how solid and healthy Harry felt compared to the thin, fragile child they'd rescued 2 months ago. Harry's cheeks were round and pink, his hair was still impossibly messy, and his green eyes sparkled with the confidence of a child who knew he was loved. "What did you build today?" Arthur asked, settling into his favorite chair with Harry on his lap. "Big tower," Harry explained, pointing to his construction with the pride of an architect unveiling a masterpiece. Mama helped. Made sparkles. Arthur looked toward the kitchen, where Molly was preparing dinner with the efficient grace of someone who had been managing large families for years. And she'd adapted to having Harry as naturally as if he'd been born to them, and watching her with him reminded Arthur daily of why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. "Mama makes everything sparkle," Arthur agreed, tickling Harry gently and earning a delighted giggle in response. Later, after dinner and baths and the elaborate bedtime ritual that had developed around reading Harry 3 stories instead of the originally agreed-upon one, Arthur and Molly sat in their small kitchen and shared the kind of comfortable silence that came from years of partnership. "How was your day?" Molly asked, pouring tea for both of them. Arthur told her about the final resignation announcements, the ongoing investigations, and the disturbing research McGonagall had found in Dumbledore's files. But Molly listened with the careful attention she gave to anything that might affect their family's safety. "Do you think he'll try to come back?" she asked when Arthur finished. "Dumbledore, I mean." Arthur considered the question. "I think he believes he was right. I think he believes that everything he did was justified by the greater good he was trying to achieve. Men with that kind of conviction don't usually accept defeat gracefully." "But Harry is safe," Molly said, more statement than question. "Harry is safe," Arthur confirmed. "He's a British citizen under the protection of both magical and Muggle law. He's surrounded by people who love him, and if anyone tries to hurt him again, they'll have to go through all of us first." Molly smiled and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "I'm proud of you," she said, quietly. "Well, for everything you've done, everything you've risked, Harry has a real life now because you were brave enough to ask the right questions." Arthur thought about that as they went upstairs to check on Harry one last time before bed. The little boy was sleeping peacefully, surrounded by toys and books, and all the evidence of a childhood filled with love and security. His breathing was even, his face relaxed in the way that only truly safe children managed. As Arthur watched his son sleep, because that's what Harry was now, in every way that mattered, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A misfiled surveillance authorization had led to the exposure of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of wizarding society. That one man's decision to ask uncomfortable questions had ultimately saved 23 children from systematic abuse and manipulation. But more than that, it had given Harry Potter something that all of Dumbledore's careful plans had never intended for him to have. A normal, happy childhood with people who loved him unconditionally. Outside their new home, February snow fell gently over the countryside, covering the world in clean white silence. Inside, the Weasley family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had fought the good fight and won, not just for themselves, but for every child who deserved to grow up loved and free. And in his small bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and picture books, Harry Potter dreamed whatever dreams happy children have, protected by people who had proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with wands or spells, but with the simple courage to stand up for what's right, regardless of the cost. The wizarding world was learning to rebuild itself around new principles of accountability and transparency. Arthur Weasley was learning that heroism sometimes came disguised as ordinary parental love. And Harry Potter was learning the most important lesson of all, that he was wanted, valued, and cherished exactly as he was. The reckoning was complete. The new beginning had already begun. Chapter 12. A Different Boy Who Lived. 6 years after the morning that changed everything, Arthur Weasley stood at the kitchen window of their home near Ottery St. Catchpole, watching his 7-year-old son chase garden gnomes with the single-minded determination of a child on a mission. Harry Potter Weasley, he'd chosen to take their name officially on his 5th birthday, had grown into exactly the kind of boy James and Lily would have wanted him to be: confident, curious, and blessed with the particular brand of mischief that seemed to run in magical families. "Harry, love, leave the poor gnomes alone," Molly called from where she was hanging laundry on the line, though her tone carried more amusement than reproach. "They're not hurting anyone." "But, Mamma, they're eating your roses," Harry protested, his unruly black hair catching the morning sunlight as he brandished a wooden sword with serious intent. At 7, he'd retained Lily's bright green eyes and James's impossible hair, but his face had filled out with the healthy roundness that came from years of proper meals and unconditional love. Arthur smiled as he watched the domestic scene unfold. This was what they'd fought for 6 years ago. Not just Harry's safety, but his right to be an ordinary little boy who worried about garden gnomes rather than prophecies or the weight of the wizarding world's expectations. "Arthur, stop daydreaming and help me with these case files," came Molly's voice from behind him, though she was smiling as she spoke. His wife had grown into her role as the unofficial coordinator of their expanded family's various activities, with the same efficiency she'd once applied to managing their household during the war. That Arthur turned from the window to find his kitchen table covered with the familiar manila folders that represented his life's work these days. As director of the Department of Magical Child Welfare, an entirely new ministry department created in the wake of the Dumbledore scandal, Arthur oversaw a network of social workers, investigators, and child advocates that ensured no magical child would ever again suffer in silence. "The quarterly reports?" he asked, settling into his chair and reaching for the nearest folder. "Kingsley dropped them off this morning. The numbers are better than last quarter." Molly joined him at the table, her own stack of correspondence from families they'd helped over the years. 3 more placement success stories, and 2 families have requested to become certified for emergency fosterage. Arthur opened the first file and felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from seeing concrete evidence of the changes they'd implemented. The Magical Child Welfare Act of 1982, informally known as the Harry Potter Protection Act by the press, had revolutionized how the wizarding world cared for its most vulnerable members. Gone were the days when powerful wizards could manipulate child placements for their own purposes. But every magical child who lost their parents now went through a comprehensive evaluation process, with multiple oversight committees ensuring their placement was in their best interests, rather than serving some adult's vision of the greater good. Foster families were thoroughly vetted, regularly monitored, and provided with ongoing support to help them care for children who might have special needs. "Mrs. Chen's latest inspection of the Morrison placement," Arthur read aloud from one report. "Young Timothy is thriving with his new family. His accidental magic has stabilized. He's sleeping through the night. Wasn't his foster parents' report that he's begun calling them Mum and Dad?" Timothy Morrison had been one of the children they'd rescued from Dumbledore's surveillance program, a 4-year-old whose parents had been killed in a Death Eater attack and who had been placed with distant relatives who treated his magic as a shameful secret to be hidden. Now, at 10, he was a happy, confident child who knew he was loved exactly as he was. "And the Clearwater girl?" Molly asked, looking through her own correspondence. "Penelope," Arthur corrected gently. They'd made it a point to always use the children's names, rather than reducing them to case numbers. Her grandmother writes that she's started showing signs of advanced magical ability. Nothing concerning, or just the natural development of a bright child in a supportive environment. It was a pattern they'd seen repeatedly over the years. Children who had been systematically suppressed or traumatized during their early years often showed remarkable recovery when placed in truly loving homes. Harry was perhaps the best example. The thin, fearful toddler they'd rescued had grown into a boy who radiated the confidence that came from knowing he was valued and protected. "Papa!" Harry's voice carried through the open kitchen door as he burst into the house with the dramatic flair of a child who had important news to share. "Papa, I made the gnomes dance. Look!" Arthur looked out the window to see a small parade of garden gnomes moving in an elaborate formation across their back garden, with their tiny legs marching in perfect synchronization to music only they could hear. It was impressive magic for a 7-year-old, the kind of complex, joyful spell work that only emerged in children who felt completely safe to explore their abilities. "That's wonderful, Harry," Arthur said, pulling his son onto his lap. "How did you learn to do that?" "I just thought about how they might like to dance, instead of eating Mama's flowers. And then they started doing it," Harry explained with the matter-of-fact tone children used for miracles. "Bill showed me how to think about what I want the magic to do, instead of just letting it happen." Arthur exchanged a glance with Molly over Harry's head. Their eldest son, now 23, and working as a curse-breaker for Gringotts, they had proven to have a natural talent for teaching children to channel their magical abilities safely. He often spent his weekends at home helping Harry and other young children in their community learn to work with their magic rather than against it. "That's very good magic, Harry," Molly said, ruffling his already messy hair. "But perhaps we should let the gnomes rest now. They look a bit tired." Harry nodded seriously and closed his eyes in concentration. Through the window, Arthur watched the gnomes slow their dancing and wander back to their usual spots among the roses, apparently none the worse for their magical choreography experience. "Will you teach me to make bigger magic when I'm older?" Harry asked, settling more comfortably on Arthur's lap. "Like Bill does with the goblins?" "If that's what you want to do," Arthur replied carefully. "But remember, there's no hurry. Magic will always be there when you're ready for it." It was a philosophy they'd developed over the years of raising Harry, letting him discover his abilities at his own pace, without pressure or expectations. So different from what Dumbledore had planned, where every aspect of Harry's development would have been carefully monitored and shaped to serve someone else's vision of his destiny. "Harry," Molly said, "why don't you go wash up for lunch? Percy's coming home today, and you know how he likes everything to be proper." Harry groaned in the dramatic way 7-year-olds reserved for minor inconveniences, but he slid off Arthur's lap and headed toward the stairs. "Or Percy worries too much," he declared over his shoulder. "Everything doesn't have to be perfect all the time." Arthur and Molly listened to Harry's footsteps on the stairs, then looked at each other and burst into quiet laughter. Their third son, now 21, and working in the Department of International Magical Cooperation, had indeed developed into someone who valued rules and propriety, though he'd also become one of Harry's most devoted older brothers, always ready to help with homework or explain the complexities of wizarding lore in terms a 7-year-old could understand. "Sometimes I wonder what James and Lily would think of how he's turned out," Molly said softly, organizing her papers with the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing family chaos. Arthur considered the question. "I think they'd be proud. He's kind, he's confident, he stands up for what he believes is right. And most importantly, he's happy." "Do you ever regret it?" Molly asked. "Everything we went through, everything we risked." Arthur looked around their kitchen, at the case files that represented dozens of children who now lived in safety, at the window that framed their garden where Harry played without fear, at the evidence of the family they'd built together, despite every obstacle. "Never," he said firmly. Not for a single moment. The afternoon brought visitors, as Saturdays often did. Kingsley Shacklebolt arrived first, to now head of the Aura office and still one of Harry's favourite uncles. He brought news from the ministry and a wooden toy broomstick that he'd charmed to fly safely 3 feet off the ground, high enough to be exciting, low enough to prevent serious injury. Minerva McGonagall came next, her weekly visit timed to coincide with tea and whatever baked goods Molly had prepared for the occasion. As headmistress of Hogwarts, she'd transformed the school into an institution that prioritized student welfare above all else, but she'd never lost her fondness for the little boy whose rescue had sparked so many changes. "How are his letters coming along?" McGonagall asked, watching Harry demonstrate his new toy broomstick's capabilities in the back garden. "Better every week," Arthur replied. "He's writing to 2 of the children from our Foster Edge program now, and he always asks to include drawings with his letters." It was part of Harry's education in empathy, understanding that there were other children who'd had experiences similar to his own, and that sometimes a friendly letter from someone who understood could make all the difference in feeling less alone. And his magical development? "Natural and healthy," Molly answered. "He experiments with spells the way other children experiment with paint or building blocks. There's no fear, no suppression, no sense that his abilities are something to be ashamed of." McGonagall nodded with satisfaction. "That's exactly what James and Lily would have wanted for him." As the afternoon stretched toward evening, their guests gradually departed, leaving the family to their usual Saturday routine. Harry helped Arthur tend the garden while Molly prepared dinner, chattering about everything and nothing in the way children did when they felt completely secure in their world. "Papa," Harry said, as they worked together to repair the rose bushes the gnomes had been nibbling, "Mrs. McGonagall says I'll go to Hogwarts when I'm 11. Will that be fun?" Arthur smiled at the question. At 7, 4 years seemed like an impossibly long time to wait for anything. "I think you'll love it," he said honestly. "It's a place where you can learn all kinds of interesting magic, and you'll make friends with other children who understand what it's like to be magical. Will you and Mama visit me?" "As often as they'll let us," Arthur promised. "And you'll come home for holidays and summers, or just like Bill and Charlie and Percy did." Harry nodded, apparently satisfied with these arrangements. "Good. I don't want to live somewhere else. I like living here with you and Mama and everyone." Arthur felt his throat tighten with the familiar surge of protective love that Harry's trust always evoked. "This will always be your home, Harry. No matter where you go or what you do, you'll always belong here with us." That evening, after Harry had been tucked into bed with his usual 3 stories, and the promise that Papa would check on him one more time before his own bedtime, Arthur and Molly sat in their sitting room and reflected on the day, and on the years that had led to this peaceful moment. "Do you think he'll have a normal childhood?" Molly asked, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what looked like another jumper in Harry's favourite shade of green. "I think he's having a normal childhood," Arthur replied. "He plays, he learns, he gets into minor trouble. He asks endless questions about everything. He has friends and family who love him. That's what normal looks like for a magical child in a healthy home." "What about when he's older? When he learns about what happened to his birth parents, about what Dumbledore planned for him?" Arthur had been wondering about that himself. Harry knew the basic facts, that his first parents had been killed by a very bad man, that he'd lived with some not very nice relatives for a short time, and that Arthur and Molly had brought him home to be safe and loved. Someday, when he was older, he'd need to know the whole truth about prophecies and surveillance programs, and the man who'd been willing to sacrifice a child's happiness for his vision of the greater good. "When he's ready," Arthur said finally, "we'll tell him everything. We'll help him understand that what happened wasn't his fault, and that the choices other people made don't define who he gets to be. We'll remind him that he's not responsible for saving anyone but himself." And if he chooses to become involved in fighting dark wizards anyway? Arthur smiled at the question. Then we'll support him, because it will be his choice made freely, not a destiny imposed on him by someone else's manipulation. Outside their window, the summer evening settled gently over the countryside. In the house around them, their family slept peacefully, biological children and chosen child alike, all safe and loved and free to become whoever they chose to be. Arthur thought about the surveillance form that had started everything, misfiled in his paperwork 6 years ago by what had seemed like bureaucratic incompetence, but might have been providence. One piece of paper had led to the exposure of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of wizarding society. One man's decision to ask uncomfortable questions had ultimately saved 23 children from systematic abuse and manipulation. But more than that, it had given Harry Potter something that all of Dumbledore's careful plans had never intended for him to have. A childhood filled with love, laughter, and the freedom to discover who he was without the weight of other people's expectations on his shoulders. The boy who lived had become simply Harry, beloved son, mischievous brother, future student of magic, and ordinary child who happened to be extraordinary in all the ways that truly mattered. And in a house near Ottery St. Catchpole, surrounded by family and friends, and the evidence of a life lived fully and freely, Harry Potter Weasley slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams happy children have when they know beyond doubt that they are loved, valued, and safe. The world was a better place because one person had chosen courage over comfort, justice over convenience, and a child's welfare over the intimidation of powerful men. It was a lesson worth remembering and a legacy worth protecting. The story of the boy who lived had been rewritten, and this version had the only ending that truly mattered. A child who got to grow up loved. Or what if Petunia Dursley left Harry on the Weasleys' doorstep at age 3 and Molly raised him as her 8th child? What if the Sorting Hat refused to sort Harry until Dumbledore answered for what he had done to the boy? What if Hermione used a time-turner to go back to the night Harry's parents died and found Dumbledore already there, watching what if Minerva McGonagall quit Hogwarts at age 60 and raised Harry in a cottage in Scotland, far from Dumbledore's control? What if Sirius Black and Fleur Delacour arrived at the Dursleys on the same night, both determined to take Harry and never bring him back? What if Cedric Diggory survived the graveyard and testified that Dumbledore knew the tournament was a trap? What if Bill Weasley broke every ward Dumbledore had placed on Privet Drive and found dark magic that should never have been nearer to child? What if Hermione found a locked room in Hogwarts that contained every child Dumbledore had sacrificed before? Harry, what if Severus Snape took Harry the night Lily died and raised him in Spinner's End without telling a soul? What if Victor Crumb offered Harry asylum in Bulgaria after the Triwizard Tournament and Hermione helped him escape? What if Harry walked out of Hogwarts in front of the entire school at age 12 and Snape was the one who held the door open? What if Pansy Parkinson overheard Dumbledore's plan in the dungeons and warned Harry before it was too late? What if Lily Potter left a second letter, hidden in Gringotts, and it named every person Dumbledore told her to trust? What if Amelia Bones launched a full investigation into Dumbledore after Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire? What if the Hogwarts portraits came, so alive during Harry's trial, and every former headmaster testified against Dumbledore? What if Neville Longbottom's grandmother Augusta demanded Harry be placed with her after she learned what the Dursleys had done? What if Draco Malfoy switched sides at age 13 after watching Dumbledore send Harry into the Chamber of Secrets alone? What if Arthur Weasley found Dumbledore's name on a ministry surveillance order for Harry filed the day after Lily and James died? What if the Goblin Nation declared Harry a protected ward of Gringotts and told Dumbledore he had no authority over the Potter vaults? What if Kingsley Shacklebolt found Harry during a routine or a check on Privet Drive and reported the Dursleys to the Ministry? What if Remus Lupin found Lily's diary in the ruins of Godric's Hollow and every entry was about Dumbledore's demands? What if Madame Pomfrey documented every injury? Harry arrived with each September and handed the file to the Wizengamot. What if Blaise Zabini and Hermione Granger formed a secret alliance in third year to get Harry out of Dumbledore's grip? What if Neville Longbottom was the boy who lived instead, and Harry grew up free, until Dumbledore came looking for him at age 14? What if every Hogwarts student in Harry's year signed a petition against Dumbledore, and Luna Lovegood delivered it to the Daily Prophet? What if Fleur Delacour brought the French ministry's auras to Hogwarts after the third task, and demanded Harry be released into her custody? What if Dobby smuggled Harry out of Privet Drive at age 6 and hid him in the Room of Requirement for 5 years before? Hogwarts, what if Winky the House Elf testified at the Wizengamot that Barty Crouch, Sr., knew about Dumbledore's plan for Harry all along,